Imagine a land at the edge of the world as it was known to its inhabitants, a broad, broken sweep of mountains and plateaus, river plains, and desert margins that gathered the wind and the stories of migrating peoples. The Iranian plateau sits like a high table, where early nomadic bands paused to water flocks and mend broken yokes, where grass met stone and the seasons measured lives in cold winters and brief, fierce springs. In that space, the shape of history was not decided by a single moment, but by a gradual accretion of habits, technologies, and ambitions. To follow the rise of Persia is to watch mobile communities knit themselves into something new and durable, a polity that would reach from the Aegean to the Indus in the space of a few generations. This was the moment when scattered tribes became a nation. Subscribe and share in the comments whether you feel closer to their hard journey through mountains or to the vision that made them believe they could unite a world. The people who would become Persian were not born in palaces. They were shepherds and horsemen whose livelihoods depended on an intimate knowledge of landscape and weather. They moved with their animals, following pasture and water, repairing tents and readying harnesses at dusk, learning to read the sky as if it were a map. That mobility bred flexibility. Leaders emerged through skill, persuasion, and success in raiding or alliance, and kinship remained the primary bond. Over time, fortunate families amassed enough followers and resources to stay in one place for a season, then for a year, until temporary encampments hardened into villages and villages into fortified towns. Climate and ecology shaped ambition. The plateau could be generous where wells and rivers offered irrigation, but it was unforgiving where rock and wind predominated. Agriculture on irrigated plains produced surplus, and surplus produced specialists, craftsmen who forged tools and weapons, potters who learned to paint with a steady hand, and traders who understood the value of distance. Metalworking changed everything. Bronze gave way to iron, and iron was lighter, stronger, and cheaper, enabling more widespread armaments and tools. Where a single household had once produced enough for itself, now there could be stores for the winter and goods to trade for horses, wine, and textiles. Riding was in the blood. Horses transformed mobility and warfare and became a visible sign of status and power. Mounted warriors could scout more ground, retaliate faster, and patrol long reaches of road or pasture. The domestication of the horse and the refinement of tack and chariot technology made leadership more centralized. Those who could command mounted followers gained bargaining power in marriages and treaties, in raids and defenses. That technological and social scene created leaders who, when opportunity arrived, were ready to gather people into something larger than kinship alone. On the western margins of the Iranian plateau, a larger pattern of state formation began to take root among related Iranian-speaking groups known later to history as Medes and Persians. The Medes, who inhabited the northwestern plateau, established a recognizable polity that controlled important trade routes and river valleys. They built citadels and engaged in diplomacy with neighboring powers. Their kings wore robes and sat with advisors, and their power was expressed as much through ceremony as through armies. The Persians, to the south in the region later known as Persis or Fars, were smaller in number but rising in ambition, led by families who traced their descent to heroic ancestors and who kept close ties of friendship and obligation. The fragmentary evidence we have is a mosaic smoothed by centuries of storytelling, but certain patterns are clear. Tribal identities mattered, but they were elastic. Alliances formed and dissolved in response to marriage, trade, and threat. The Persians learned from their neighbors. They borrowed administrative practices from Mesopotamia, artistic motifs from Anatolia, and military tactics that adapted to the new realities of cavalry and iron. This borrowing was not passive imitation but a selective adoption that suited the needs of a people who still valued mobility and personal loyalty. Out of this ferment came a family of leaders known to history as the Achaemenids. Their name, passed down in inscriptions, associated them with a founder whose traditions reached back into the mist of oral memory. Achaemenid chieftains controlled land and followers around the region of Pasargadae, and by the 6th century BCE their fortunes and reach began to grow. It mattered that they were neither the largest nor the most powerful at first. Their genius lay in timing and in the character of their leaders. Cyrus, later called Cyrus the Great, is the figure around whom a new narrative coalesces. His rise was not a single, inevitable moment but a chain of decisions and campaigns that capitalized on the weaknesses and disputes of neighboring rulers. Where the Median kingdom was powerful but internally strained, Cyrus saw chance. Through alliances and battlefield successes he displaced Median hegemony and absorbed its resources and networks. What followed was rapid expansion, and with it a new idea of rulership that blended Persian energy with administrative knowledge inherited from sedentary societies. Cyrus's conquests changed the map of the Near East. Lydia and Anatolia fell before Persian power, and the wealthy kingdom of Croesus was absorbed into a broader imperial structure. Then Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, succumbed not through ruin but through careful policy and psychological mastery. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he presented himself as a restorer more than a conqueror, allowing temples to remain standing and many elites to continue their roles under a new sovereign. That approach eased the transition from local rule to imperial administration and gave Cyrus an advantage that pure force alone could not buy. Cyrus's policies were notable for an element that would become a hallmark of Achaemenid rule: relative tolerance and pragmatic governance. He returned displaced peoples to their homelands and permitted local religious practices to continue. The famous text known as the Cyrus Cylinder reads like a proclamation of legitimate rule, whether its modern reading as a declaration of human rights is overstated or not. The underlying political genius is clear. By recognizing and co-opting local elites, Persian rulers reduced resistance and built loyalty in a multi-ethnic empire. The administrative challenge of governing such a varied domain was enormous, and it fell to later rulers, especially Darius, to formalize the solutions. Darius organized the empire into satrapies, administrative provinces each overseen by a governor or satrap who collected tribute, maintained troops, and enforced the king's laws. This system balanced central authority with local autonomy, allowing the central government to extract resources and secure borders without micromanaging daily life in distant cities. It required constant vigilance. However, satraps could become too powerful, and the king had to maintain a network of spies, messengers, and loyal troops to check them. To bind the empire together physically, the Persians built what we might call infrastructure. Roads were not merely convenient, they were arteries of power. The famous Royal Road connected Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, enabling couriers to move with remarkable speed and mail to circulate across vast distances. Way stations provided fresh horses, inns provided rest for travelers. This was more than engineering, it was statecraft. Information and goods flowed faster, and the king's reach extended across what had been obstacles to swift rule. Engineering went beyond roads. Persian rulers invested in irrigation systems that revived ancient canals and in qanats, underground channels that brought water from aquifers to parched lands, allowing agriculture to flourish in otherwise marginal zones. Such projects required investment and labor and signaled the state's capacity to mobilize resources for public benefit. The visible outcomes were fields of grain and vines that sustained cities and armies, but the invisible ones included a sense of order and predictability that underpinned loyalty. Darius also standardized economic practice by regulating weights and measures and by minting coinage that facilitated trade. Before coins, barter and various regional currencies complicated long-distance commerce. The introduction of a reliable imperial standard simplified transactions, encouraged markets, and stimulated demand for Persian and foreign goods alike. Coins carried the image of the king, too. There were small proclamations of authority that circulated in pockets from Sardis to Susa. The Persian military was as adaptive as its administration. It combined the cavalry strengths of its nomadic predecessors with infantry drawn from subject peoples and from Persian levies. The famed Immortals, a standing force of elite troops whose numbers were kept constant, provided a visible core of military power and an emblem of royal prestige. Persian armies could be vast, and they drew on the manpower of a diverse empire: archers from the east, light infantry from coastal provinces, chariots where terrain permitted. Their strategy often favored flexibility and the use of diplomacy to avoid unnecessary destruction. Yet the ambition to rule a vast, diverse empire created friction. Subject peoples chafed at heavy tribute, and provincial rulers sometimes rebelled. Communication delays, the difficulty of enforcing standards over great distances, and cultural misunderstandings all fed periodic uprisings. The Persians responded with a mixture of force and conciliation, suppressing revolts when necessary but also incorporating local administrators and customs to reduce friction. This mix of firmness and accommodation kept the empire stable for generations but demanded constant attention from the center. Persian kings cultivated symbols of legitimacy. Royal inscription and architecture were part of the same program, to display the king's power, his divine favor, and his role as restorer and protector. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, great halls rose on a man-made terrace where carved reliefs showed subject peoples bringing tribute and the king seated in solemn grandeur. These images were about more than pride. They were communications meant to be read by visiting delegations and by the ruler's own bureaucracy, reinforcing a cosmology in which the king's order mirrored cosmic harmony. Art and craft flourished under imperial patronage, drawing artisans from across the empire who brought varied techniques and motifs. From Anatolian animal friezes to Mesopotamian relief carving and Elamite inscriptions, Achaemenid art fused diverse elements into something visually coherent. Materials ranged from carved limestone to glazed brick, from precious metals to finely woven textiles. The portability of artistic styles reflected the mobility of craftsmen and the state's ability to commission and relocate talent when and where it was needed. Religion in the Persian world is complex and often misunderstood. Zoroastrianism, with its concepts of cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood and its emphasis on ritual purity, influenced Persian royal ideology but did not monopolize spiritual life. The empire encompassed worship of moon and river deities, Mesopotamian gods, Egyptian cults, and local rituals that predated Persian rule. The state's policy of religious tolerance was partly pragmatic, preserving local institutions that helped maintain order, and partly ideological, allowing the king to present himself as protector of tradition and patron to multiple cults. The king's image as guarantor of cosmic order often rested on performing sacrifices, building temples, and restoring shrines damaged in conflict. Such gestures had diplomatic significance. When Cyrus portrayed himself as allowed to worship Marduk in Babylon, he was signaling the continuity of sacred power. The language of rulership thus encompassed both the mundane, roads, taxes, and law, and the transcendent, the maintenance of sacred order that justified the king's authority in the eyes of subjects from different ethnicities and faiths. Administration required record-keeping, and the Persians adopted cuneiform and created their own Old Persian inscriptions for monumental use. Elamite and Akkadian served as administrative languages in many contexts, and scribes trained in these scripts ensured continuity with older bureaucratic traditions. This multilingual administrative apparatus helped unify the empire while accommodating regional differences. Archives of tablets, seals, and letters reveal an empire preoccupied with contracts, land tenure, and the movement of goods and troops. The everyday life of people under Persian rule varied with geography and social position. A farmer in Babylonia tinkered with irrigation, paid a share of harvest as tax, and attended local festivals. A craftsman in Sardis might fashion jewelry for elite patrons and trade with ships in the harbor. Soldiers served for seasons and returned to their villages. Administrators moved between court and province. For many, the greatest change was not the identity of their ruler but the increase in contacts, the abundance of foreign goods on the market, and the chance for ambitious individuals to find new roles within the imperial machine. Persian policy toward conquered elites offers a lesson in governance. Instead of wholesale dispossession, the Persians often allowed local dynasts to keep their positions under Persian suzerainty. This practice smoothed the transition and co-opted elites who possessed local knowledge and networks vital for tax collection and order. It also created a cosmopolitan governing class that spoke multiple languages and navigated complex loyalties, and that could be deployed in different parts of the empire when needed. Trade under Persian rule expanded dramatically. Caravan routes connected Mediterranean ports with Mesopotamia and farther east, bringing spices, textiles, metals, and ideas. Maritime commerce along the Persian Gulf and the Aegean linked cities that had once been isolated by distance. Markets thrummed with goods from Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and distant Bactria, and the movement of merchants accelerated cultural exchange in ways that left ambiguous traces in art and language. The Persian Empire's expansion brought it into contact and often into conflict with the Greek city-states along the Aegean and in Ionia. Greek and Persian interactions were not defined only by hostility, they included trade, intermarriage, and cultural borrowing. Yet competing interests and Persian support for different factions in Greek politics inflamed tensions that culminated in the Persian Wars. Those clashes would become the subject of legend and historical debate, but at the time they were one layer of a larger struggle over control of coastal territories and maritime trade. The wars with Greece tested the limits of Persian power and required massive mobilizations. Early Persian defeats and victories alike revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities. Enormous resources could be mustered, but projecting power across seas and maintaining supply lines for campaigns in foreign terrain proved difficult. For Greeks, the wars became a crucible for identity. For Persians, they were costly engagements that required reflection and recalibration. The memory of those wars would echo through centuries of Western writing about Persia, shaping later imaginations of the empire as much as its actual institutions did. Within the imperial court, rituals and etiquettes reinforced hierarchy. Audience procedures, the distribution of gifts, and the performance of ceremonies structured relationships between the king and his subjects. Delegations from subject nations participated in visually choreographed tribute scenes, each item of wealth a symbol of submission and a practical contribution to the royal household. The court was a theater of power where words mattered as much as swords and where diplomacy could prevent war. Yet the Achaemenid court was not monolithic. Palace politics included rivalries among royal kin, jealous satraps, and competing factions that sought access to the king. Court intrigues sometimes led to purges and plots, and succession could provoke instability. These dynamics required kings to build coalitions, use marriage ties, and sometimes resort to force to secure their position. The human drama behind imperial stability was continuous. Ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and compromise all played roles. In architecture, the Persians combined monumental scale with refined detail. Grand stairways and hypostyle halls at Persepolis dramatized royal presence, while columned palaces conveyed dignity and order. Reliefs carved into stone depicted processions and courtly scenes in a style that emphasized clarity and continuity over realism. Function and symbolism coexisted. Palaces housed administration and received envoys, but they also carried messages about the cosmic order that justified the king's rule. Material culture reveals everyday tastes as well. Persian textiles displayed complex patterns that traveled across the empire, while metalwork and jewelry fused local and imperial styles. Seals engraved with intricate designs authenticated documents and goods and circulated widely. Even cuisine reflected imperial diversity, with spices and cooking techniques moving between regions, and with banquets serving as occasions for political theater as much as nourishment. Music and performance traveled as well, accompanying religious rites and court ceremonies. Musicians and entertainers were drawn from across the empire and performed for kings and provincial elites alike. Artisans specialized in music-making objects and in instruments whose sounds marked celebrations and ritual observance. Such cultural exchanges created a shared repertoire of sounds and gestures that helped knit an enormous population into a vaguely recognizable imperial world. Language and literacy evolved under Persian administration. Old Persian inscriptions served a propagandistic purpose, carved in monumental locations to proclaim the king's deeds. At the same time, daily administration relied on Elamite, Akkadian, and local scripts that scribes used to manage leases, tax rolls, and legal disputes. The multiplicity of languages was both a challenge and a resource. Imperial scribes who mastered several tongues were invaluable intermediaries who kept the machinery of government oiled. The question of identity in the Persian Empire is subtle. Being Persian was not an ethnic badge alone, but often a political and administrative identity linked to service and loyalty to the royal house. Local identities continued to exist and were often proud and durable, yet the empire cultivated a sense of shared purpose among its elites through ceremonies, road connections, and the circulation of officials and troops. Over generations, the idea of Persian broadened to encompass a variety of peoples who together upheld imperial structures. Revolts never ceased. From the Ionian uprisings to revolts in Egypt and Central Asia, maintaining control was a constant preoccupation. Sometimes revolts were harshly suppressed, other times they led to negotiated concessions. The incapacity to maintain perfect control is not a sign of weakness alone. It is also the sign of a complex polity grappling with the logistics of governing a world larger than the ancient imagination often allowed. Each rebellion taught new lessons about balance, punishment, reconciliation, and the limits of force. External threats and internal dissension combined in long cycles that shaped the empire's fortunes. Military defeats in the West weakened perceived prestige, and court intrigues could erode cohesion at critical moments. Conversely, competent rulers who could manage satraps and inspire armies strengthened the state. The fortune of empire turned on leadership as much as on structural resilience. When talent and opportunity matched, the empire expanded, and when they did not, contraction followed. One of the defining administrative legacies of the Achaemenids was their model of provincial governance: appoint a satrap, establish a fiscal system, and keep the routes of communication open. This blueprint would influence subsequent empires in the region. The concept of an organized, multi-ethnic polity with delegated authority and standardized procedures was not new, but the scale and coherence achieved by the Persians made it a template for empires to come. Cultural syncretism was an enduring effect of Persian rule. From the blending of artistic motifs to the mingling of religious practices, the empire facilitated exchanges that were not simply one-way. Local traditions continued and adapted, while imperial institutions adopted and standardized useful elements. This cross-fertilization produced long-term developments in art, law, and administration that persisted even after the empire's political structures faded. When Alexander of Macedon marched into Asia, the Persian world met a new kind of challenge. Alexander's campaigns were rapid and brutal, and they exploited court divisions and the fatigue of long rule in some provinces. Yet the collapse of the Achaemenid political structure did not erase Persian culture or administrative practices. Alexander relied on Persian officials in many places and adopted symbols of Persian kingship to legitimize his authority to his new subjects. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid world, was sacked during Alexander's advance, a dramatic moment recorded by ancient sources with moral and political overtones. The destruction shocked contemporaries and later generations, though it was neither total nor representative of the entire Persian world's fate. Many administrative and cultural practices survived, adapted to new rulers, and fed into the Hellenistic synthesis that defined the post-Achaemenid Near East. Archaeological evidence has deepened our understanding of Persian statecraft and daily life. Excavations at sites like Pasargadae and Persepolis reveal palaces, audience halls, and storerooms whose architecture and contents testify to administrative complexity. Granaries, seal impressions, and administrative tablets uncover details about taxation, labor organization, and logistics. Objects such as jewelry and pottery document trade networks and tastes. They are the scattered clues that, assembled, tell a story of continuity and change. Primary literary sources remain crucial but must be read with care. Herodotus wrote with a Greek perspective and sometimes with a moralizing agenda, and Mesopotamian chronicles carry their own local biases. Persian royal inscriptions present an official image that must be weighed against evidence from temples, letters, and archaeology. Cross-examination of these sources allows historians to discern a fuller picture, one that recognizes both propaganda and pragmatic governance. Modern scholarship has refined many earlier assumptions. Where 19th-century narratives sometimes simplified Persian tolerance into mythic benevolence or painted the empire as a monolithic despotism, recent studies highlight complexity. The Achaemenid state was adaptive, sometimes harsh, sometimes lenient, and always pragmatic. It was held together by institutions, shared rituals, and a recognition that ruling a patchwork of peoples required negotiation as much as decree. The legacy of Persia extends into the administrative habits of later states and into the cultural memory of many peoples. Concepts of provincial governance, standardized coinage, and imperial communication channels reappear in successive empires. Persian art and architecture influenced styles in Central Asia and the Mediterranean, and Persian administrative models informed imperial practices in the Hellenistic and later Parthian and Sasanian worlds. Even where political structures collapsed, cultural and institutional residues endured. The story of Persia's rise is therefore not only a tale of conquest but also one of integration, the merging of mobile pastoralist energy with the sedentary mastery of irrigation and record-keeping. The result was an empire that could draw on the strengths of both lifestyles, mobility and responsiveness from its nomadic roots, and permanence and abstraction from its bureaucratic innovations. That combination made the Achaemenids nimble enough to expand and organized enough to endure for generations. Legacy also means the stories people told about the empire. In later Persianate cultures, Achaemenid kings were remembered as models of justice and grandeur, sometimes mythologized and often invoked as evidence of an ancient imperial tradition. For Greeks and Romans, Persia served as both rival and mirror, a foil for self-definition that shaped Western historical imagination. In the modern era, the Achaemenid legacy has been invoked by national narratives and scholarly projects alike, reflecting continued fascination with an empire that bridged worlds. One can trace the threads of Persian influence in material techniques as well. The use of monumental reliefs to convey political messages, the incorporation of Ionic columns in Persian palatial architecture, and the diffusion of textile patterns are all examples of how Persian tastes traveled. Craftsmen trained in one city often moved to another in search of royal commissions, and workshops specialized in filling elite demand for luxury goods. The movement of artisans was itself a form of cultural diplomacy. A sustained empire depends on finance as much as on force. Tribute systems, standardized taxation, and controlled minting allowed the Persians to field armies, build palaces, and maintain roads. Yet fiscal demands could be oppressive, and grievances over levies played a role in many revolts. The central administration's ability to collect revenue depended on local collaboration, which is why the co-optation of local elites was not merely generous policy but a fiscal necessity. The image of the Persian king as dispenser of justice also had tangible implications. Royal proclamations and edicts attempted to assert legal norms across diverse territories, and judges and local councils adjudicated disputes within local customs. The king's role as supreme judge could be invoked to settle conflicts between powerful families or to validate property transfers. In this way, imperial law and local tradition coexisted uneasily but functionally. Persepolis stands again as a symbol worth lingering over, not simply for its ruins but for what it reveals about imperial ritual. The terrace, the columns, the carved processions embody a political culture that prized ceremony and representation. Visitors from distant provinces walked into halls that told them, in stone, who ruled and why. That physical encounter with imperial ideology was as important as any tax collector or military unit in sustaining the perception of an ordered world under a single house. The Achaemenid system also relied on human networks, couriers, officials, and informants who transmitted orders and gathered intelligence. The royal messenger system was legendary for its speed and reliability, a network of relay stations that made the empire shrink for those who used it. Intelligence about uprisings, economic trends, and foreign threats flowed through these channels, enabling rulers to make informed decisions, albeit always lagging behind reality by the limits of communication speed. Another dimension of Persian rule was its engagement with technology and standardization. The state sponsored weights and measures to reassure traders and taxed agricultural production according to predictable patterns. Agricultural techniques, such as crop rotation and irrigation maintenance, were preserved through official directives and local knowledge. This practical interest in standards helped create a predictable environment for commerce and farming across unequal landscapes. The empire's borders were porous and often contested. Nomadic groups along the fringes maintained degrees of autonomy and sometimes posed threats or offered alliances, depending on the season and the politics of the moment. The Persian approach to frontier management mixed military presence with diplomacy, offering gifts and forging marriage ties to pacify volatile neighbors. That strategy was a recognition that violence alone could not secure vast and diverse boundaries. Despite the empire's power, the human cost of rule deserves attention. War, forced labor on state projects, and heavy taxation all created suffering for ordinary people at times. The grandeur of royal palaces and the sheen of coinage cannot hide the hard labor that filled granaries and armed the king's soldiers. Understanding the rise of Persia means acknowledging both the achievements of governance and the burdens it imposed on many of its subjects. Scholars continue to debate the role of ideology versus pragmatism in Persian policy. Were acts of tolerance calculated administrative moves or expressions of a genuine imperial ethic? The answer is both. Practical utility and moral language combined to create policies that appealed to a wide range of peoples. Kings used religion and ceremony to legitimate pragmatic measures, and administrators used legal language to justify fiscal demands. This interplay of ideas and expedients gave the empire a resilience that was part moral structure and part administrative competence. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire does not erase its imprint. After Alexander's campaigns, successor states adopted, adapted, and sometimes rejected Achaemenid practices. The Seleucid, Parthian, and later Sasanian empires all bore echoes of Achaemenid administrative concepts, urban forms, and imperial ideology. In this way, the Persian model acted like a set of tools transmitted across centuries, reshaped by new hands but recognizable in function and form. Material survivals persist in museum cases and excavation sites, but also in traditions of architecture and governance that reinvent Achaemenid precedents. Columned halls, relief sculpture styles, and administrative divisions reappear in later palace complexes across the Near East. The memory of a cosmopolitan court that integrated many peoples lived on in princely households and imperial ceremonies, shaping how future rulers imagined sovereignty. The very idea of empire in the Persian case was distinctive not only for its scale but for its capacity to hold diversity together without fully assimilating it. Rather than enforcing a single culture, the Persians encouraged multiplicity under an overarching political order. That approach reduced the costs of conquest and allowed local identities to persist, producing an empire that was both vast and plural. Looking back, the rise of Persia can be read as a practical answer to a set of problems: how to secure resources, manage trade, legitimize power, and maintain peace among diverse peoples. The solution combined military capacity, infrastructural investment, bureaucratic innovation, and a flexible stance toward local customs. It was not always elegant or humane, but it was effective enough to create a polity that transformed the ancient world in fundamental ways. One of the lasting lessons of the Persian experiment is the centrality of adaptability. From nomadic roots, the Persians learned to govern, not by erasing difference but by institutionalizing mechanisms that could contain it. They built an imperial vocabulary of governance, satraps, roads, coinage, courts, that facilitated interaction across continents and cultures. That vocabulary, and the institutions that embodied it, would outlive the dynasty that created them. The rise of Persia also reminds us how material conditions and human choices intertwine. Geography offered resources and constraints. Technology made new forms of mobility and communication possible. Leaders made choices that expanded opportunity or magnified risk. Those convergences created an environment in which an ambitious family could, within a few generations, move from local chieftainship to imperial rule that shaped the destiny of millions. To listen to the story of Persia's ascent is to hear a chorus of voices: shepherds and craftsmen, satraps and scribes, kings and captives. Each contributed to an evolving political order that was at once pragmatic and symbolic. The Achaemenid project succeeded because it learned to use the tools available: administration, force, ritual, and infrastructure to create cohesion where chaos might have prevailed. Finally, the story remains unfinished because its echoes continue to shape how we think about empire, diversity, and governance. The rise of Persia shows that large political formations can be both instruments of domination and laboratories of cultural integration. As you travel through the modern landscapes that were once under Persian rule, you pass over layers of history built by decisions, compromises, and creations that are legible if you know how to look and listen. In the beginning there is a name that feels like a promise, a single syllable that opens the geography of an ancient world and reshapes it into possibility. Cyrus rose out of the steppes and the river plains with a clarity of purpose that sounds almost modern when you listen for it, as if some architect of human affairs had sketched a plan for unity and then set a man to realize it. He did not imagine sameness or erase difference, but he dreamed of a world joined by law, trade, and a common respect for local customs. This dream would be his inheritance to generations and his burden to history, a bold experiment in governing diversity at remarkable scale. To tell of Cyrus is to begin with landscape, the highlands where Persis meets the Median Plateau, the brown sweep of pasture and olive groves, the narrow passes that funnel armies and the rivers that carry grain. He emerged from a milieu of clans and chieftains, where kinship and loyalty mattered more than borders, and he learned early that loyalty could be crafted through respect and reward rather than fear alone. His rise was not a single leap but a series of patient moves, alliances and marriages, strategic patience and sudden decisiveness. The world he looked upon was fractured into small kingdoms and great rivalries, but he saw in that fracture not only danger but the possibility for a larger order. From the hilltops of his youth, Cyrus watched the Medes consolidate power under a king whose weight could crush any rival, and yet he discovered a path through subtlety and courage. He did not simply wait for weakness, he fostered it with diplomacy and selective defiance, drawing allies from discontented elites and promising them inclusion in a new polity. When he struck, he did so with a precision that belied the romantic tales that would later surround him, and his victories reshaped the map from the Anatolian coast to the heart of Mesopotamia. Each conquest added a voice to the chorus he hoped to lead, and with every addition he refined his idea of rule. Pasargadae, his chosen seat, grew like an idea given form, a city whose tomb would later testify to a ruler who valued order and elegance rather than mere opulence. There, in stone and garden, Cyrus attempted to harmonize the many languages and faiths he governed, laying out spaces where different peoples could continue their practices while contributing to a common framework. His architecture and urban vision were as much about symbolic inclusion as they were about administration, an early hint that empire had to be felt as well as commanded. In Pasargadae, he planted the seeds of what empire could be when it sought legitimacy through accommodation instead of erasure. The conquest of Lydia and the defeat of Croesus became a focal episode in Cyrus's career and a mirror for his approach to kingship. Croesus, famed for wealth and luxury, represented the old order of fierce city kings and extravagant courts, and his fall signaled a new style of rulership that married economic integration with pragmatic governance. The wealth Cyrus acquired was not merely treasure to be hoarded but capital to be invested in roads, artisans, and the systems that knit his realm together. Through these resources he underwrote a sophisticated bureaucracy and the material basis of an empire that would span continents. Cyrus's capture of Babylon in 539 BCE stands as one of the most resonant achievements of his life, not because it was the largest prize but because of how he framed the victory. According to accounts preserved in various traditions, he entered the city as liberator more than conqueror, presenting himself as restorer of temples and protector of cults rather than as obliterator of local institutions. The nuance of his policy lay in the restoration of local religious life and the pardon of defeated peoples, gestures that bought him legitimacy far beyond what a mere display of force could have achieved. His message was clear. The empire would be an umbrella under which diverse practices could find shelter, and the bond he offered was mutual obligation instead of unilateral domination. They started divided and ended united. Subscribe and write in the comments what hits you harder, the pain that forged them or the vision that kept them moving forward. Embedded in the clay of this era is an artifact that would be called the Cyrus Cylinder, a small but eloquent record of policy and princely rhetoric. It reads like a charter, asserting that Cyrus had been chosen by the gods to improve the lives of the oppressed and to restore order where injustice had reigned. While modern readers may debate whether it is an ancient human rights proclamation or a polished piece of propaganda, its effect on later imagination is undeniable, and it has been used for centuries as a symbol of enlightened rule. Whether law or lyric, it marks the intent to govern by principles that acknowledge the dignity of cities and the sanctity of their customs. There was a very practical side to this ideology, and it lived in the daily mechanics of rule: satraps who collected tribute, scribes who preserved records in Aramaic and other tongues, and an emerging system of logistics that could sustain armies and trade across vast distances. The satrapal system was clever in its decentralization, allowing local authorities to continue functioning while remaining accountable to the central king. Cyrus encouraged local elites to retain position and prerogative so long as they recognized the larger imperial order, a strategy that eased transitions and prevented constant rebellion. This hybrid governance was less about creating a uniform state and more about constructing an architecture of accommodation. Travel the King's Road in your mind and you will glimpse how Cyrus's empire functioned as a network of exchange and communication, a ribbon of commerce and intelligence that linked mountain passes to seaports. Caravans carried not only goods but stories, law codes, and artisanship, and they created an economic metabolism that enriched the cities and calmed the frontiers. A fast relay of messengers and well-built waystations allowed the central authority to project presence and respond to crises, knitting the empire with a skeleton of infrastructure. The result was an imperial reach that could move men and ideas with a speed that seemed miraculous in a world of foot and horse. Currency and standardization mattered in this vision, and the Persians encouraged practices that eased trade between disparate peoples, from Lydian coinage to weight standards and measures. By facilitating exchange, Cyrus did more than accumulate wealth. He created predictable relationships between merchants and rulers, and that predictability fostered trust across cultural boundaries. Markets became spaces of cross-cultural encounter, where barter and negotiation produced hybrid crafts and shared tastes that bound the empire together. In economic life, as much as in law and ritual, Cyrus's policies promoted a layered unity rather than a flattening homogeny. Religious policy under Cyrus has been the subject of debate, but the pattern is unmistakable: tolerate, restore, and in public recognize the gods of the conquered. If Cyrus himself held a particular theological conviction, the record is quiet or ambiguous, which may have been by design. A ruler of a multi-ethnic realm could gain far more by invoking plural authority than by imposing a single creed. He authorized the rebuilding of temples and the return of exiles, gestures that resonated profoundly with the subject peoples and that turned potential enemies into grateful allies. This religious accommodation became one of the most potent tools of governance, a soft power that cemented loyalty in ways armies could not. Among the most famous of those restored was the community in Judah, where the return from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple entered sacred memory. The Persian policy toward the Jews would be remembered and retold for millennia, and it became central to Cyrus's legacy in Judeo-Christian traditions as a divinely guided liberator. His name appears in Scripture not simply as a conqueror but as an instrument of providence, a role that shaped later interpretations of his rule across cultures and centuries. This intersection of politics and providence is a window into how empires are also stories told about themselves and reimagined by those they touch. But empire was never merely benevolence, and Cyrus's reign contained hard choices and stark contradictions that complicate any simple portrait of a liberal ruler. Military campaigns brought death and displacement as surely as they brought integration, and local elites who lost power sometimes paid with their lives or property. The machinery of tribute could be burdensome, and satraps sometimes became predatory when the center's gaze faltered. Cyrus's genius lay in balancing these pressures without letting coercion be the primary language of rule, but coercion remained part of the bargain. The composition of Cyrus's army reflected the empire's diversity, drawing Persians, Medes, and subject peoples into a multi-ethnic force with varied traditions of warfare. This was practical as much as symbolic. Cavalry and archers, chariots and infantry complemented one another across terrain, and commanders learned to deploy different tactics according to local strengths. Military organization under Cyrus combined central command with regional autonomy, a pattern that allowed rapid mobilization without a constant, draining standing army. That mix of flexibility and discipline kept the empire secure while avoiding the fiscal burden of perpetual militarization. Cyrus was also a patron of craftsmen, a king who valued skill and subtlety in the objects his designers produced. Persian art under the Achaemenid dynasty would become known for its precise stone carving, elegant metalwork, and textiles that blended motifs from across the empire. Craftsmen were often relocated or invited to imperial workshops, fostering a syncretic aesthetic that signaled both unity and respect for local traditions. The visual language of royal palaces and administrative buildings communicated the empire's values: order, cosmopolitanism, and controlled splendor. Language served as another unifying thread, and Aramaic became the lingua franca for administration across Cyrus's domains. It was not an erasure of native languages but a practical tool for governance, permitting records, decrees, and correspondence to move efficiently. This adoption illustrates how empire often depends on pragmatic choices rather than ideological imposition, a lesson Cyrus seemed to grasp intuitively. By facilitating communication, he enabled disparate communities to participate in a shared polity without surrendering their distinctiveness. The royal title itself tells a story. King of Kings suggests an architecture of sovereignty that recognizes subordinate rulers while asserting ultimate authority. It was a clever linguistic solution to a complex political problem, allowing local kings to rule under the aegis of a greater monarch without constant humiliation. Cyrus cultivated an image of magnanimity, portraying himself as a superior ruler bound by a duty to safeguard the well-being of the many kings under his rule. That image, once crafted, became a template for his successors and for later imperial ideologies. But succession would test any such template, and Cyrus's death left the Persian project to heirs who struggled to match his balance of vision and restraint. Cambyses, his son, expanded the empire into Egypt but did so with an intensity that sometimes veered toward brutality, revealing the thin line between conquest and governance. After Cambyses, Darius reorganized the empire with administrative reforms, tribute assessments, and monumental building projects that hardened the imperial machine Cyrus had begun. The transition shows how a founder's dream can be institutionalized, and in that process some of its fluidity is lost even as its reach grows. Darius's inscriptions and administrative records show a matured bureaucracy that owed much to the foundations Cyrus laid: standardized tribute, a network of satrapies, and an imperial ideology adapted for wider application. Yet even as the apparatus improved, the ethical questions of empire persisted: who benefited from centralized power and at what cost to local autonomy? The Persian experiment continued to be an exercise in negotiation and the constant adjustment of central authority to local interests. It is a reminder that empire is not static but a living system that must be managed and reinvented by each generation of rulers. Across the Mediterranean, the Persian expansion brought it into collision with Greek city-states whose political ideals often stood at odds with monarchy. These clashes, culminating in famous battles and long wars, framed much of how the ancient world remembered Persia, sometimes as a tyrannical other, sometimes as a grand civilization. Greek writers like Herodotus and Xenophon offered portraits shaped by rivalry, admiration, and cultural bias, producing narratives that have long colored Western perceptions. Their accounts are invaluable but imperfect mirrors, reflecting both Cyrus's greatness and the anxieties of his opponents. Herodotus records episodes that are vivid and human, tales of negotiation, defeat, and the eccentricities of kings, while Xenophon attempted an ethical biography in Cyropedia, imagining Cyrus as a model ruler. The truth lies between these stories and archaeological records that illuminate administrative tablets, seals, and ruins, reminding us that our knowledge is a tapestry of texts, objects, and landscape. Cyrus's life becomes a conversation across sources, a dialogue that historians refine and readers reinterpret in each era. To listen is to follow that conversation and allow the uncertain details to remain part of the narrative's richness. Persepolis, later the ceremonial heart of the empire, emerged after Cyrus but owes its conceptual roots to his mode of rule, a place where subject nations presented tribute and ritualized their loyalty in a choreography of diversity. Its reliefs show delegations in distinctive dress and with characteristic gifts, a visual poem about the multiplicity the empire encompassed. Though Persepolis' stones belong to a later generation, they echo Cyrus's initial idea that authority could be performed through ritual inclusion rather than mere subjugation. The palace complex became a statement about imperial order and the artistry through which it was legitimated. Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae is another striking symbol, a simple and dignified structure that conveys a sense of restraint in a region accustomed to grand monuments. The epitaph attributed to him, whether authentic or later embellishment, speaks of a ruler who wished to be remembered as just and benevolent, and the tomb's sparing aesthetics suggest a philosophy that prized proportion over extravagance. Visiting the site, even in imagination, offers a meditation on mortality and the modest ambitions of a man who reshaped the world. It underlines how leadership can aspire to permanence yet remain humanly fallible. The environmental and economic landscapes that Cyrus governed were complex and required careful stewardship if the imperial machine was to function. Irrigation systems in Mesopotamia needed maintenance, mountain pastures required careful rotation to prevent overgrazing, and trade routes depended on the security of roads and ports. Cyrus's administration encouraged local management of resources supported by imperial oversight, an approach that blended central planning with regional knowledge. The empire's sustainability depended less on grand speeches than on the routine work of leveling fields, fixing canals, and supporting craftsmen. Inevitably, tensions emerged at the fringes, where cultures met and borders flexed with the seasons and politics. Rebellions flared when satraps misused power or when economic pressures made tribute unbearable, and the center had to negotiate with local elites, sometimes by military force and other times by concession. Cyrus's talent lay in preventing those tensions from becoming chronic. He established channels for grievance and reward that diffused potential explosiveness. Even so, the empire's external boundaries remained porous, shaped by ecology as much as by diplomacy. Cyrus's diplomacy was at times personal and theatrical, an art of ceremonies, oaths, gifts, and negotiated marriages that bound the aristocracy in webs of mutual interest. He understood that kingship depended on face-to-face relations and that hospitality and generosity could be as binding as treaties. Royal presence in a region could unsettle rivals and reassure allies, and the rituals that accompanied imperial visits were carefully orchestrated to display both power and magnanimity. These performances turned politics into a shared language of prestige and obligation. Consider as well the cultural exchanges seeded by Cyrus's openness. Artistic motifs migrated across lands, religious ideas mixed, and culinary tastes shifted as new ingredients and cooking techniques spread. The empire became a crucible for hybrid identities, where local artisans incorporated foreign motifs to appeal to broader markets and where cities adopted cosmopolitan habits to thrive. This cultural dynamism softened the edges of difference and created a common aesthetic vocabulary that complemented legal and economic ties. In that way, the Persian dream of unity manifested not only in law but in the ordinary acts of daily life. Yet unity did not mean uniformity, and Cyrus respected the resilience of local customs, allowing communities to govern according to their traditions where possible. He institutionalized a form of pluralism that allowed law codes to coexist, and this legal patchwork was often enforced by local judges familiar with particular customs. Such plural legal orders reduced friction because people could live according to recognized norms rather than an alien central code. The result was an empire where diversity was not merely tolerated but integrated into the governance structure. The arts of administration, record-keeping, taxation, and logistics became the unseen muscles of the empire, and Cyrus cultivated capable bureaucrats to strengthen those muscles. Written records preserved decisions and transactions, enabling a continuity of governance that outlived many rulers and provided the backbone for economic growth. Literacy in selected languages became a lever of power, and the bureaucracy's efficiency depended on training scribes, developing standard forms, and preserving archives. This managerial genius helped the empire endure beyond the immediate charisma of any single king. Cyrus's influence extended beyond his lifetime into the moral and political imagination of later empires, serving as a model for rulers who sought to reconcile power and justice. Alexander the Great revered him and claimed a kind of kinship, and Roman authors would eventually frame Persian kings as both exotic and instructive in their governance. Even in modern times, Cyrus has been invoked as a symbol of enlightened rule, sometimes earnestly and sometimes for rhetorical convenience. He has become a mirror in which each age sees its hopes and anxieties about empire and sovereignty. But we must also reckon with the darker strands of imperial life, the imposed burdens and the violence that annexation often entails, for compassion in policy does not erase the fact of conquest. Peoples were uprooted, traditions disrupted, and the coercive power of empire could crush dissent with speed and efficiency. Recognizing these truths does not negate Cyrus's achievements, but it complicates them, reminding us that even visionary projects rest on foundations that can be both creative and destructive. History wants neither simple veneration nor wholesale condemnation, but a careful appraisal of complexity. In the long sweep of antiquity, Cyrus's model provided a template for managing diversity that influenced not only his immediate successors but also the political strategies of distant rulers. His methods suggested that inclusion, religious tolerance, and infrastructural investment could be powerful instruments of empire, and those lessons traveled in the baggage of diplomats and merchants. The idea that a polity could be bound by shared institutions rather than forced cultural assimilation was an innovation whose lineage can be traced through later imperial experiments. Thus, Cyrus's dream seeded future possibilities for political cohesion without cultural annihilation. At the same time, the Persian Empire catalyzed a flourishing of scholarship and knowledge, as the movement of peoples brought together astronomical, medical, and literary traditions. Centers of learning in various cities amassed information and techniques that cross-fertilized, enriching astronomy with new observations and medicine with novel remedies. Imperial patronage financed the copying of texts, the training of specialists, and the preservation of administrative knowledge, creating a bureaucratic continuity that supported intellectual life. The result was not an intellectual monoculture but a polyphony of disciplines that advanced practical and theoretical understanding. Women's roles in this world were variegated and often mediated by local traditions, yet royal women could wield considerable influence through marriage alliances, courtly patronage, and dynastic politics. Queens and princesses sometimes served as key diplomatic agents, and court ceremonies provided arenas where women could exercise agency behind the scenes. While much about gender roles remains shadowed in the record, glimpses of female power remind us that imperial life had many dimensions beyond battlefields and palaces. The social fabric of the empire was woven by countless women whose labor and relationships sustained communities. Trade routes that crossed the empire carried spices, textiles, metals, and ideas, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Aegean and the Indus to the Caspian. These networks were arteries of fortune, and safe passage under imperial order encouraged merchants to extend their ranges, increasing wealth and variety of goods. Taxation of trade was a major revenue source, and the state invested in security and infrastructure because it paid dividends in stability. Such economic integration created interdependence among cities and regions, weaving a shared destiny that could bind the empire in times of calm. Education and training for administrators became a quiet art that amplified imperial competence, as scribal schools taught the skills necessary for record-keeping and law enforcement. These institutions cultivated a professional class that could implement policy across languages and regions, and the standardization of training enhanced cohesion. This human infrastructure was as vital as physical roads, because effective rule depends on people who can translate high principles into daily practice. The bureaucracy that grew under Cyrus's influence turned local knowledge into state capacity. The Persian legal and fiscal apparatus also fostered economic innovation, encouraging craft specialization and urban growth in cities that served as nodes for production and exchange. Cities under imperial protection could attract artisans and merchants who relied on a predictable market and safe transport. Urban life became a crucible for new forms of social organization, guilds, and workshops that negotiated with imperial officials for rights and protections. The bustling streets and bazaars of these cities testify to the dynamism that empire can unleash when it invests in order and fairness. Yet the reach of empire had limits, imposed by geography, by the stamina of subjects, and by the vagaries of climate and plague. Droughts and bad harvests strained the relationship between ruler and ruled, forcing administrations to balance fiscal demands with the basic needs of populations. Epidemics could ravage troops and civilians alike, complicating campaigns and exposing administrative weaknesses. Cyrus's management of resources and responsiveness to crises helped the empire endure, but it also revealed how fragile human systems can be in the face of environmental stress. Identity within the empire was not static but fluid, and many people adopted hybrid allegiances, identifying with city, dynasty, or profession as circumstances required. Soldiers who served in imperial armies might form attachments to their units more than to distant kings, and merchants often formed cross-cultural networks that transcended political boundaries. This layered identity made governance more nuanced, because loyalty could be cultivated through multiple channels, and Cyrus's policies recognized and exploited that complexity. It was a politics of multiple anchors rather than a demand for singular devotion. To imagine the soundscape of Cyrus's empire is to hear many languages, the clash of metal and the lowing of animals, the merchants haggling and the priests' chants, all under a sky where couriers sped along well-kept roads. Cities rang with the life of markets and workshops, while hinterlands hummed with agricultural labor and seasonal migrations. The empire was a living mosaic of noises and rhythms, an orchestra of practices conducted by an administrative hand that sought harmonization rather than homogenization. This sensory richness made the empire resilient and fascinating. Cyrus himself remains partly a silhouette, both human and archetype, for the sources are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Ancient narratives paint him as both visionary and warrior, while material remains offer glimpses of his policies and practice. Modern historians must weave these threads together carefully, resisting the temptation to idealize or dismiss him. The complexity of his portrait is the reward of studying him closely, because it teaches us how political imagination and material governance intertwine. The diplomatic language he perfected allowed rival courts to negotiate without constant war, and treaties, marriages, and ceremonial exchange became staples of a political repertoire that kept the peace along many frontiers. Such protocols reduced the need for perpetual bloodshed and created expectations that could be appealed to in disputes. This ritualization of diplomacy was a sophisticated technique, shaping an interstate order that prized stable relations over episodic conquest. It is the kind of political art that transforms raw power into durable governance. Examine the coinage and seals from the period and you will find images that convey authority without obliterating difference, often combining symbolism familiar to local communities with imperial motifs. Seals in particular served as signatures of trust, securing documents and goods across the empire, and their iconography reveals a world comfortable with plurality. The visual vocabulary of authority thus became a shared language, recognized by administrators and merchants alike. This melding of imagery helps citizens and subjects recognize a common framework of legitimacy. The military logistics that supported Cyrus's campaigns were more than brute force. They were systems of provisioning, reconnaissance, and adaptation to local conditions that allowed armies to move swiftly across diverse terrain. Campaigns were planned with attention to forage, supply lines, and seasonal weather, and the ability to mobilize resources quickly separated successful conquest from disastrous folly. This sophistication suggests a ruler attentive to practical detail and capable of coordinating vast human and material resources. It explains, in part, how an idea of a united world could be translated into concrete political achievement. Cyrus's engagement with local elites was not merely coercive but often collaborative, as he sought to build coalitions that could administer regions effectively on behalf of the empire. He recognized that local knowledge was indispensable and that co-opting existing institutions could be more stable than replacing them. This pragmatic inclusivity created buy-in among provincial leaders who saw advantages to affiliation with the imperial center. It was a political calculation that balanced respect for autonomy with the need for overarching authority. Through time, Cyrus's image has been recast by pilgrims, rulers, and scholars, each finding in him what they needed: a liberator, a lawgiver, a founder, or a symbol of national identity. Modern nation-states have sometimes evoked him to claim continuity with ancient glory, and humanitarians have used his story to frame ideas about tolerance. Such reinterpretations are part of the afterlife of great leaders, and they reveal as much about the interpreters as about Cyrus himself. The persistence of his image across cultures speaks to the deep human appetite for exemplars who promise just rule. The Persian model also influenced modes of taxation and resource distribution in subsequent empires, showing successors how to finance armies, build public works, and manage grain stores to buffer against famine. These economic techniques became templates that other polities adapted to their local circumstances, demonstrating the transmission of administrative knowledge across civilizations. The capacity to learn from precedent is one of the central legacies of Cyrus's era, as systems designed for empire became part of a broader human repertoire of governance. In this sense, his innovation was as much institutional as territorial. Military diversity in Cyrus's forces also created a cultural mixing that enriched tactics and technologies, as engineers, cavalrymen, and archers from different regions exchanged techniques and equipment. Siegecraft improved through the sharing of methods, and defensive technologies spread across borders as artisans learned from their counterparts in foreign courts. This technological cross-pollination was as consequential as trade in shaping the ancient world's capabilities, and it underscores how empire can accelerate innovation by bringing diverse skills into contact. The resulting military sophistication made the empire formidable and adaptable. The legal pluralism we touched on earlier also shows up in contract law, property disputes, and inheritance practices, where local custom was allowed to guide outcomes while overarching principles prevented exploitation. Courts under the imperial umbrella often had to reconcile contradictory traditions, and the art of compromise became institutionalized in legal practice. This ability to mediate difference prevented many local conflicts from becoming imperial crises, ensuring that everyday disputes did not escalate into political ruptures. Such legal dexterity was a hallmark of a state that valued stability as much as authority. If we follow the threads of trade to the sea, we find Persian maritime interests expanding under later rulers but rooted in the networks Cyrus cultivated, connecting inland producers to coastal markets and beyond. Ports became gateways not only for goods but for ideas, and seafaring facilitated long-distance cultural exchange that enriched societies across the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. The maritime dimension of empire demonstrates how land-based governance can generate ripple effects that reshape distant shores. Cyrus's policies thus had an oceanic afterlife as well as a continental one. Art and ceremony at court served ideological functions, projecting an image of cosmic order in which the king mediated between gods, peoples, and the forces of nature. Festivals and rituals choreographed loyalty and allowed subject nations to witness a vision of harmony enacted through music, dance, and procession. These spectacles reduced the sense of coercion by infusing political relations with meaning and ritual reciprocity. They were the theater of empire, persuading more people than edicts alone ever could. Cyrus's death on campaign leaves us with a poignant counterpoint to his achievements, that even the boldest dreamers are mortal and that empires must outlast their founders if their visions are to endure. His successors institutionalized many of his practices while adding their own inflections, and the empire evolved as it encountered new challenges. The balance between unity and pluralism had to be continuously renegotiated, and that ongoing work is what sustained imperial life. The story of Cyrus thus becomes a story of ideas put into institutions and tested by time. To return to the image with which we began, Cyrus dreamed not of erasing difference but of creating a political stage where many cultures could coexist under a shared roof. His policies did not aim to make everyone the same but to make coexistence administrable and mutually beneficial, a pragmatic cosmopolitanism that emphasized rights and duties rather than uniformity. The dream of a united world that preserves its multiplicity resonates across centuries because it addresses a perennial human problem: how to live together without losing what makes us distinct. That is the heart of Cyrus's legacy, a quiet ambition as relevant now as it was then. Looking outward from the ancient capitals, the waves of migration, conquest, and trade that Cyrus set in motion continued to ripple for centuries, shaping empires and polities far beyond the Persian heartland. Alexander's conquests and the subsequent Hellenistic world would absorb Persian administrative techniques and institutional patterns, blending them with Greek ideas to create new forms of governance. Rome and later powers encountered and adapted Persian precedents, and even modern states draw on administrative concepts that incubated in that ancient crucible. The long arc of Cyrus's influence reminds us that political inventions can travel and mutate across time and space. In listening to this long story, we should also note the human smallness within it: artisans carving seals, scribes copying records by candlelight, farmers tending barley fields, mothers teaching children local songs and languages now almost lost. Their lives were the true substrate of empire, the daily continuity that enabled grand politics to be more than an elite performance. Cyrus's policies interacted with these lives in ways both profound and mundane, shaping opportunities and constraining choices. To imagine the empire is to hear their voices as well as the trumpet of kings. Modern historians continue to debate whether Cyrus was primarily motivated by power, principle, or a combination of both, and the ambiguity is part of what makes his figure enduring. He was clearly ambitious, yet he also displayed a consistent pattern of mercy and inclusion that suggests a coherent ethic of rule. Whether his tolerance was strategic or sincerely held is a question that may never be resolved, but the consistency of its practice across regions implies more than opportunistic rhetoric. The best explanation may be a fusion of prudence and principle, a ruler who understood morality to be an instrument of governance. As narratives about governance go, Cyrus's story offers instructive paradoxes: an empire built through conquest that nonetheless promoted local autonomy, a ruler who commanded vast resources yet valued modesty in death, and an administrative genius who relied heavily on the judgment of local authorities. These paradoxes explain why modern thinkers have long turned to Cyrus when imagining alternatives to absolutism or debating the ethics of empire. He personifies the possibility that power can be shaped to protect plural life rather than to extinguish it. That possibility is the real inheritance of his dream. There is also the matter of myth and memory, how later generations shape a founder into a paragon or a monster according to their needs, and Cyrus has been both throughout history. His portrayal has been elastic, expanding to accommodate religious narratives, national myths, and political theories, a testament to his symbolic potency. Each reframing adds another layer to the historical Cyrus, making the task of reconstruction both richer and more complex. The multiplicity of his images underscores the ways history serves present questions as much as it reconstructs past facts. Consider the archaeology that recovers the gritty realities of imperial administration, tablet archives with lists of rations, seals that secured shipments, and storage records that reveal the scale of provisioning required to sustain armies and cities. These mundane documents are as eloquent as any inscription, showing how food, grain, and labor were organized and accounted for. They ground the romantic narratives and practicalities that mattered to ordinary people. Through them we see how governance is an endless series of small calculations that together create stability. Cyrus's approach to justice often involved symbolic acts, restoring temples, releasing prisoners, and recognizing local customs that humanized rulership and created goodwill. These acts had political leverage because they signaled a ruler's capacity to do more than punish; he could repair and protect. Justice thus became a tool of statecraft, an offer of reciprocity rather than only a mechanism of coercion. That blend of ethical and pragmatic governance is one of the reasons his name persisted as an ideal. From a military vantage point, Cyrus taught commanders to respect the terrain and to recruit local knowledge, understanding that victory often depends on outthinking as much as outfighting the enemy. He used negotiation and diplomacy as extensions of military strategy, recognizing when to strike and when to bind foes into alliances. This flexible use of force and persuasion meant that conquest did not always result in obliteration, and often left the structures of society intact for smooth incorporation into the empire. Such restraint improved the odds of lasting rule. As centuries passed, the Persian model would be emulated, adapted, and sometimes rejected, but the core idea, that diverse peoples could be governed under a common political canopy, remained powerful. It informed debates about federalism, autonomy, and the balance of power in later ages, a conceptual heirloom passed down through statecraft. The question of how to reconcile local identity with broader political unity is still debated today, and in that contemporary conversation Cyrus's example retains relevance. He offers an ancient case study of pragmatic pluralism that continues to speak across time. Finally, to close this segment of the story is to resist finality, because Cyrus's dream was not an endpoint but a seed. The empire he founded would change, grow, fracture, and be reborn in other forms, and each transformation carried traces of his original insight. The dream of a united world that honors difference remains unfinished, a challenge to every generation that seeks to organize human plurality into just and durable institutions. Listening to Cyrus's life is less about idolizing a man than about learning how political imagination and practical governance can converge to make ambitious projects possible. When you hear the name Persia, think of a vast sweep of sky over deserts and plateaus, a realm stitched together by rivers and roads, and a succession of rulers who imagined empire as both obligation and art. The story that arrests us most vividly is that of Darius and his successor Xerxes, two kings who translated imperial ambition into monuments, laws, and armies. Their lives illuminate not only the machinery of power but the very habits of imperial thought, how rulers justify themselves, how they mobilize subjects, and how they meet resistance when worlds collide. Darius arrived at the throne in a moment of chaotic promise, a man who rose not only by force but through a careful calibration of legitimacy. He was the organizer, the one who looked at a patchwork of peoples and said that a great body requires a proportional skeleton, roads, officials, and a language of law. He believed that authority could be made visible in stone inscriptions, standardized coinage, and a system of delegated governors who answered to him without erasing local customs. From the outset, Darius presented himself as a restorer and a reformer, not merely a conqueror. He displayed this idea most famously on the Behistun inscription, where he carved his own narrative into the cliff face like a ruler who writes history into the earth itself. In that text he pronounced his lineage, set forth the reasons for removing rebels, and offered a glimpse of how Persian kings thought their rule should be seen, ordered, divinely sanctioned, and durable. But to imagine Darius only as a bureaucrat would be to miss the theatricality of his reign. He poured wealth into Persepolis, a rising ceremonial capital whose terraces and palaces announced imperial grandeur in a language of reliefs and columns. Those carved processions of tribute-bearers are not idle decorations, they are propaganda in stone, showing a world that brings its goods to the king and thereby recognizes his place at the center of a cosmic economy. Accompanying these public statements was a more private political genius, the satrapy system. Darius divided the empire into regions, each governed by a satrap who collected taxes and maintained order. This delegation reduced the friction of distant rule and allowed swift mobilization, but it also created new tensions between centralization and local autonomy that would test the empire's durability. The Royal Road is the most famous answer to that logistical question, an artery of communication stretching across miles so that messages and couriers could travel with unprecedented speed. Herodotus marveled at the messengers who covered ground without rest, likening them to the modern notion of a postal service, and the road itself became an instrument of cohesion. When a realm stretches from the edge of the Indus to the Aegean, speed of communication is as decisive as the size of the army. Darius introduced standardized taxation, which turned the diverse wealth of the empire into predictable revenue. Instead of a tangle of occasional levies, he set a system that allowed him to calculate how many troops he could mobilize and where money would be spent. That predictability changed the relationship between ruler and subject. It smoothed the mechanics of empire but also taught subordinate peoples the arithmetic of submission. At the heart of the Persian model was a delicate reciprocity, tribute and permission in exchange for protection and a degree of local autonomy. Conquered city-states could keep many of their traditions as long as they paid and did not foment rebellion. This pragmatic tolerance allowed Persia to absorb a variety of languages and religions, from Egyptian temple cults to the gods of the Levant, and turn them into instruments of imperial stability. Yet the very openness that made Persia flexible also made it porous, and when sparks of rebellion ignited in one corner they could spread like dry grass. The Ionian cities on the Anatolian coast provide a vivid example. They were Greek-speaking, wealthy, and culturally distinct, yet under Persian sway. Their revolt in the early 5th century BCE exposed tensions between autonomy and the obligations of empire and set the stage for a collision of civilizations. Darius reacted to the Ionian revolt with decisive force, not merely to punish but to reassert a principle: the king's authority must be recognizable and enforceable. He launched punitive expeditions, reinforced garrisons, and restructured the governance of rebellious regions. In doing so, he sent a message across the empire that defiance would be calibrated with harshness, but even a king can misjudge the depth of resentment or the international consequences of stern measures. It was the Ionian episode that eventually drew Greece into Persian calculations. The Ionians had appealed to mainland Greek cities for support, and when Athens and Eretria answered their plea by sending ships, the Persian court noticed. For Persia, the sudden involvement of mainland Greeks transformed a regional disturbance into a threat to imperial prestige. A handful of city-states that had defied the king became, in Darius's calculation, a potential contagion of resistance. This is the context in which the famous Persian invasions of Greece must be understood, not as an inevitable clash of civilizations, but as a sequence of decisions by leaders who measured risk, honor, and opportunity. Darius proposed punitive expeditions across the Aegean, assembling fleets and marshaling resources in an empire with phenomenal wealth. Those preparations imposed an enormous strain, a test of administrative competence as much as military valor. Marathon, the first great meeting of Persian and Athenian forces on the European mainland, remains a compelling story because of its asymmetry and because of the way small city-states could act decisively. The Persians, expecting to find easy submission among fractious Greek polities, instead encountered a unity born of terror and pride. The Athenians and Plataeans, though outnumbered, brought a cohesion and tactical audacity that surprised the invaders. While Darius intended Marathon as a lesson in Persian might, the battle became a symbol of resistance for the Greeks. Details are debated and embellished in the telling, but what matters for us is the larger dynamic. The clash exposed limits to imperial assumptions. A force accustomed to subjugation found itself confronting a people whose political culture prized autonomy and lethal cooperation in times of danger. Darius did not live to see the full consequences of Marathon. He died before another major campaign could be mounted, but his plans did not die with him. They passed instead to his son, Xerxes, who inherited both the throne and a vision of expanding Persian authority. Xerxes arrived as a king of a different temperament, more introspective, more theatrical, and possessed of an absolute sense of destiny. Xerxes' accession was a mix of ceremony and calculated consolidation. He had to secure the loyalty of satraps, placate nobles, and navigate the fatal mix of palace intrigues that had felled previous rulers. His reign would be shaped by an ambition to surpass his father's achievements and to complete what he imagined as an ancestral duty, to carry Persian power to the very edges of the known world. He also inherited massive administrative structures that allowed him to plan a campaign on a continental scale. These structures included not only fleets and infantry but specialists, engineers, and bureaucrats who could organize supplies for tens of thousands. Such planning required meticulous attention to detail, lists of grain requisitions, timetables for transport, and mapped routes across ravines and seas. Xerxes' preparations for the invasion of Greece are the stuff of legend because they reveal how imperial power seeks to transform geography itself. The famous pontoon bridges at the Hellespont, a bold engineering feat that chained ships together to create a crossing, embody the audacity of Persian logistics. They demonstrate that empire was not only about men and gold but about an ability to manipulate the landscape to fit political aims. The crossing at the Hellespont, however, involved more than ropes and timbers. It symbolized a king's relationship with fate and the gods. When a storm destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes ordered a harsh punishment of the sea, an act as theatrical as it was pious, scattering lashes at the water and consigning fetters as if to bind the sea itself. Those moments are telling because they show how Oriental kings merged practical command with ritual gestures intended to affirm cosmic right. As Xerxes gathered his armies, the Persian host became a spectacle of diversity, a living map of the empire's peoples. Subjects from afar came bearing their arms and colors: Median contingents, Phoenician mariners, Elamite centers, and Egyptian levies. For Xerxes, parade and might were inseparable. To lead such a mosaic was to demonstrate the cohesion he alone could provide. On the Greek side, the response was halting and complex. The city-states were independent, suspicious of one another, and opposed to submission, yet they lacked a single political center that could easily coordinate defense. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and others had to negotiate alliances, reconcile rivalries, and decide whether to fight on land or sea. That indecision was not weakness but a reflection of differing histories and priorities. Sparta, with its warrior culture and strict training, represented a different kind of response than democratic Athens. Spartan society had oriented itself toward land warfare and hoplite phalanxes, formations of heavy infantry whose coherence depended on discipline and collective trust. Athens, by contrast, was a maritime power with a burgeoning fleet and a civic culture that thrived on debate and participation. These different strengths would shape the choices the Greeks made in the looming contest. The Greeks were fortunate, perhaps, that geography offered narrow places to fight, passes and straits where numbers counted for less. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, became the stage for a famous stand where a few thousand Greeks could hold off a much larger force. That terrain turned numbers into a tactical disadvantage for the Persians and allowed the Greeks to make every soldier's action count more dramatically. The stand at Thermopylae itself is an exercise in courage and tragedy. Led by King Leonidas of Sparta, the Greek force held the pass for days, inflicting disproportionate casualties. Their defiance became a form of moral victory, an assertion that the will to resist could slow history, even if it could not stop the immediate wave of invasion. Meanwhile, at sea, the Persian and Greek fleets maneuvered for advantage. The Persian navy had scale and skill, drawing on Phoenician and Ionian seafarers with centuries of maritime experience. Yet the tactics that had served them in the open Mediterranean were less effective in narrow straits where the Athenians, with their triremes, sleek, fast warships designed for ramming, could exploit agility and intimate knowledge of coastal waters. The naval engagements at Artemisium and later at Salamis show the shifting calculus of the conflict. At Artemisium, the fleets fought in rough weather with ambiguous success. The confrontation demonstrated that technological and numerical superiority were not unassailable advantages. Salamis, near the entrance to the Saronic Gulf, would become a decisive moment. It combined cunning strategy with local seafaring expertise to change the campaign's trajectory. The Athenian leader Themistocles occupies a central role in that maritime theater. He recognized that Athens' future depended on sea power and pushed for the expansion of the fleet, a controversial decision that bore fruit when the fleet could be used strategically. At Salamis, he plotted to trap the Persian ships in waters that would neutralize the advantage of Persian numbers and to force an encounter on terms favorable to the Greeks. Xerxes' decision to engage at Salamis illustrates the tension between imperial hubris and the pragmatics of war. He had expected a swift submission and an orderly campaign. Instead, he found himself maneuvering against a people who refused to be used to Persia's script. Salamis forced him to confront the limits of remote command and the difficulty of coordinating a multinational navy under central control. The battle itself is vivid in the telling: cramped waters, the crash of hulls, orders shouted across waves, and crews fighting for the control of oar and rudder. The outcome was not merely a victory of tactics, it was a blow to the imperial myth that Persia could subdue Greece at will. Salamis caused Xerxes to reassess his campaign and ultimately withdraw a large portion of his forces back across the Hellespont. Retreat did not mean failure in total, but it marked a turning point. Xerxes' withdrawal left a fragment of the Persian army to continue operations under other commanders, and the war persisted on various fronts. The campaigns that followed, including the crucial land battle at Plataea, would further consolidate Greek resistance and confirm that the Persian bid to conquer Greece was not a foregone triumph. Plataea itself combined the full weight of Greek hoplite warfare with a new confidence born of recent victories. The Persian forces, though still formidable, had lost momentum and local initiative. At Plataea, the Greeks' collective experience in close combat proved decisive, and the Persian field army suffered a catastrophic reverse that effectively ended the major land operations in mainland Greece. This military failure carried deeper political reverberations. The Persian court had to reconcile an enormous investment of resources with a result that did not produce the expected lordship. The failure forced a recalibration of policy. Persia would seek to maintain influence through local proxies and indirect means rather than immediate conquest. It was a reminder that empire is as much about diplomacy and reputation as it is about direct rule. After the immediate wars, the Persian approach shifted toward containment and pragmatic hegemony rather than open annexation of mainland Greece. They supported factions within Greek politics, sought to secure the loyalty of coastal cities, and focused on the security of maritime routes. Over time, the empire reconciled itself to a new status quo in which influence could be preserved without the direct administration of certain territories. Beyond the battlefield, Darius and Xerxes left enduring imprints on Persian society. The palaces they built, the administrative reforms they implemented, and the roads they paved shaped the daily life of millions. The image of royal power was made tangible through architecture and ceremony. Receptions in Persepolis were performances of empire where delegate and king reenacted a hierarchy that bound subject peoples into a shared ritual order. Persepolis itself is crucial to understanding the Persian imagination. Its terraces, stairways, and audience halls were designed to inspire awe and to assert a cosmopolitan identity for the empire. Reliefs of delegations from distant lands approaching the throne were not mere decoration, they were visual treaties, carving the terms of recognition and reciprocity into stone so that every visitor understood their place in the imperial universe. Art and ritual reinforced authority by creating a shared vocabulary of gestures and meanings. The king received tribute, sealed commands with symbols of office, and presided over ceremonies that fused religious gestures with political law. These rituals made power legible and gave the court a language through which it could translate diversity into obedience. Religion, too, played an ambiguous role in legitimizing rule. Persian rulers were not dogmatic evangelists. They tended to adopt a pluralistic approach that accommodated local cults while promoting a moral ideology that emphasized order, truth, and the king's role as guardian. Zoroastrianism, the religion associated with Persia, emphasized cosmic dualities and the king's duty to maintain truth, a convenient theological underpinning for imperial governance, even if many subjects clung to indigenous cults. This religious framework allowed the kings to present themselves as divinely sanctioned, as agents who stood between the world of chaos and the world of order. Rituals and inscriptions proclaimed that the king upheld law and justice, and this had practical consequences. It made resistance not only a political act but a moral transgression. To oppose the king was to engage in disorder, to serve him was to participate in a cosmic equilibrium. Economically, the empire depended on a delicate balance of extraction and investment. Revenue from agriculture, trade tariffs, and tribute funded monumental projects and standing armies, but the kings also invested in infrastructure that stimulated commerce. Harbors, canals, and roads increased the movement of goods and people, creating a feedback loop in which imperial peace could foster prosperity, which in turn reinforced loyalty. Currency reform, too, was functional politics. Introduced to standardized transactions, coinage reduced the friction of trade and allowed the state to collect taxes more predictably. Money also carried images and inscriptions that disseminated royal iconography across regions, turning commerce into a subtle vector of propaganda. Darius and Xerxes also confronted rebellions that tested the empire's cohesion. Local rulers, ambitious satraps, and disaffected populations occasionally rose in reaction to heavy-handed governors or to the allure of independence. The imperial response varied between accommodation and suppression, reflecting the king's preference for stability over punitive spectacle, yet the message remained consistent. The imperial center would not allow fractures to widen into permanent secession. The administration of justice across this enormous territory was no small matter. Governors had to adjudicate disputes, uphold royal decrees, and integrate local legal customs into an overarching framework. The king's reputation for fairness could either pacify provinces or provoke resentment, and so Persian rulers often cultivated images of impartiality even as they relied on force when needed. Language and culture were instruments of governance rather than tools of erasure. Aramaic, a lingua franca of the Near East, became the administrative language because it facilitated communication among disparate peoples. Persian was not universally imposed. Instead, pragmatic multilingualism became the norm, allowing the empire to operate efficiently without demanding cultural uniformity. The military organization of the Persian Empire combined professional corps with levied contingents drawn from subject peoples. The famous Immortals, an elite unit often described as perpetually maintained at a strength of 10,000, served as the royal guard and a symbol of continuity. But beneath such celebrated units lay a vast mosaic of forces whose loyalty depended on pay, patronage, and the skill of commanders to integrate diverse tactics. This diversity could be an advantage in campaigns that required cavalry, archers, or specialized siege engineers from different regions. At other moments, it presented coordination challenges, as commanders had to harmonize tactics across cultural differences. The Persian general staff were thus as much integrators as tacticians, translating local talents into coherent battlefield roles. One of the most striking features of Persian imperial policy was its accommodation of local elites. Instead of wholesale displacement, the empire often co-opted regional leaders, letting them keep titles while binding them to royal objectives. This co-optation created networks of loyalty that were durable but also vulnerable. If a local elite chose to defect, he could take with him networks of influence that destabilized broader regions. Family and succession politics always defined the upper reaches of imperial life. The court was a theater of alliances, betrayals, and marriages that could elevate one clan while undermining another. Darius himself had to secure his line, legitimizing his sons and ensuring a smooth inheritance, a task that Xerxes inherited with varying success and which would shape the dynastic stability of the Achaemenid house. Xerxes' personal character has been debated by historians ever since. He appears at moments as a contemplative ruler who mused on destiny, and at others as a harsh and extravagant man whose decisions were colored by pride. Ancient narratives, particularly those written by Greek historians, sometimes paint him as a caricature, the archetypal Oriental despot. Modern perspectives, more cautious, emphasize the complexity of a monarch trying to navigate unprecedented expectations from within and without. The Greek narrative of these wars is as much a construction as a record. Herodotus, the classical source for much of this period, wrote with a storyteller's instincts, weaving together eyewitness reports, local legends, and moral reflection. His account shaped how later generations imagined the Persian Wars, elevating certain episodes into the realm of myth while leaving other aspects underexplored. This is why it matters to read Herodotus critically. His generosity of detail is invaluable, but so too is his cultural lens. Archaeology, fortunately, provides a counterpoint to literary narratives. Excavations at sites like Persepolis, Susa, and the Aegean coasts yield material traces that confirm, complicate, and sometimes contradict textual claims. Pottery shards, palace foundations, and inscriptions anchor the stories in physical reality, giving us a more textured sense of Persian life beyond the battlefield. Cultural exchange between Greece and Persia persisted even through warfare. Trade, diplomacy, and intermarriage created channels through which ideas flowed, artistic motifs, technological know-how, and religious concepts traveled back and forth. The Aegean and Anatolian seaboard became a contact zone where hybridity shaped art, architecture, and even cuisine, reminding us that conflict and exchange often coexist. The end of Xerxes' great campaign did not extinguish Persian ambition. The empire endured for many more decades, adapting to new conditions and continuing to play a central role in Near Eastern politics. Yet the wars with Greece had left scars and reshaped perceptions on both sides. Greeks saw Persia as a model of monarchical power, while Persians learned the limits of coercion in certain terrains and cultures. In later memory, these encounters would be retold in myriad ways. For Greeks, the resistance against Persia became a founding narrative for ideas about freedom and civic virtue, though their own polities were hardly models of consistent liberty. For Persians, the wars were part of a larger chronicle of kingship that emphasized endurance and the maintenance of order. Each culture mined the past for lessons that fit its present exigencies. As you travel along modern roads that trace parts of the Royal Road, or gaze on the sparse remains of a palace, it is easy to see how time softens and refashions memory. Stones erode, reliefs fade, but the traces persist enough to remind us that empires are both fragile and monumental. They exist in the deeds of rulers, the labors of artisans, and the lives of ordinary people who bore taxes and found their livelihoods under imperial law. There is also a moral complexity to this history that resists simple judgment. Persia's tolerance and administrative genius coexisted with coercion and conquest, with moments of enlightened rule alongside brutal suppression. Darius and Xerxes were part of a system that brought order and opportunity to many but also demanded loyalty and submission from those it dominated. The Greek-Persian Wars, then, are not merely battles but a mirror reflecting broader questions about power, how it is justified, how it is exercised, and how it is remembered. They force us to consider the meaning of sovereignty when empires collide with independent polities, and to ponder how cultural identities are forged in competition and contact. For the listener, these themes resonate because they are not remote abstractions but familiar dilemmas writ on a historical canvas. Looking closely at the personal stories within this grand sweep reveals the texture of the era. There are anecdotes of soldiers who deserted or changed allegiances, of craftsmen who carved royal reliefs, of farmers who supplied grain convoys, and of courtiers who whispered counsel in palace halls. These human moments ground the larger structures in real lives, reminding us that imperial history is a constellation of individual choices as well as institutional designs. Consider also the role of intelligence and subterfuge in these campaigns. Spies, political emissaries, and disinformation played as large a role as triremes and infantry squares. Xerxes and his generals received conflicting reports, navigated betrayals, and sometimes acted on flawed information, which complicated strategic decisions and underlined the fog of war that affects even the most meticulous plans. Technological and logistical ingenuity appear repeatedly in the narrative. Siege machines, naval construction techniques, and the management of supply chains testify to an age of practical innovation. The empire's capacity to engineer bridges, fortifications, and fleets reflects a world in which knowledge was applied to political purposes, where engineers and clerks were as crucial as generals and kings. Music, poetry, and courtly life also shaped the empire's atmosphere. Bards and reciters preserved tales of heroic kings and lamented lost battles. Musicians accompanied banquets where delegates from distant lands conversed in a dozen tongues. Such cultural life made the court a hub of exchange and shaped the human sensibility of power, smoothing over divisions with ritualized hospitality and performance even as it reinforced hierarchies. Turning to the aftermath of the wars, one sees shifts in power that reverberated through the eastern Mediterranean. Greek city-states, emboldened by their successes, embarked on their own ventures and sometimes rivalries, while Persia refocused on consolidating its eastern territories and securing trade routes. This rearrangement set the stage for future conflicts and alliances that would shape the classical world for generations. The long-term historiographical impact of Darius and Xerxes is significant. They became symbols in later histories, Darius as the capable organizer, Xerxes as the archetypal imperial monarch. Their reigns were used as reference points in debates about monarchy, governance, and the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. Even modern scholars and novelists draw upon their stories to explore the nature of leadership and ambition. In the end, the tale of Darius and Xerxes is more than military narrative, it is a meditation on empire as a human project. Their reigns illuminate how rulers envision a world shaped by their will, and how the reality of geography, culture, and resistance reshapes those visions. We are left with an image of empire as a conversation between power and place, economy and faith, ambition and inertia. The ruins of the empire, finally, teach us patience. Stones do not speak in the way texts do, they whisper. Carved reliefs, ruined palaces, and faded inscriptions require interpretation and imagination. They invite us to reconstruct worlds that were once vibrant and contested, and to understand that history is a dialogue between what was fabricated by power and what endured through ordinary human activity. As you listen while driving or engaged in some other task, consider how the lives of Darius and Xerxes intersect with our own questions about leadership and responsibility. They remind us that rulers must mobilize resources, cultivate legitimacy, and anticipate resistance. They also show how unpredictable human agency can be when smaller communities act with conviction. These lessons are not merely ancient, they are enduring patterns of political life. If you find yourself wanting more, the story only deepens when you explore the marginal voices, the satrap who negotiated peace behind the scenes, the sailor who rode in an Athenian trireme, the woman in a provincial town whose household supported an army through taxation, or the artisan who carved a relief at Persepolis. Each carries a narrative strand that complements the grand sweep, turning imperial history into a tapestry of lived experiences. Ultimately, the Persian encounters with Greece under Darius and Xerxes are a study in the limits of power and the resilience of local identities. Empires can be enormous and well-organized, but they are never immune to the unpredictability of human choice. In that tension between the capable administration of empires and the stubborn autonomy of communities lies the drama that has fascinated storytellers for millennia. So let the images linger. The carved figures descending a palace staircase with gifts, the thrum of a dockyard building triremes, the tight noise at Thermopylae where few stood against many, and the choked waters at Salamis where oars and hope collided. These scenes are not static relics, they are moments of decision that changed lives and altered the course of history. And remember that history is never finished. The interpretations of Darius and Xerxes change with each generation, colored by new evidence, new questions, and new perspectives. Our present agendas shape which aspects of the past we highlight, and in that way the past is always being reimagined to serve the needs of the present. In the quiet after the roar of campaigns, Persia continued its long life, morphing through dynasties yet retaining a core identity forged in the age of Darius and Xerxes. Their reigns distilled practices of governance, cultural pluralism, and monumental artistry that would echo for centuries. The empire's resilience and adaptability are part of its legacy as much as its military ambitions. As this narrative winds through politics, battles, and everyday life, it keeps returning to a single idea, that power is relational. Kings like Darius and Xerxes were powerful because others recognized their authority, directly or indirectly. Their authority depended on networks of consent, the administration of justice, the mobilization of resources, and the projection of symbolic acts. Remove one of those supports and the architecture of power begins to tremble. We end not with a tidy moral but with an invitation to listen further. Darius and Xerxes occupy a vast chapter of human history that prompts questions about leadership, the ethics of rule, and the ways in which societies reconcile diversity under a single banner. Their stories remain compelling because they speak to the perennial human struggle to build order without crushing the life that makes order worth having. Imagine a land that stretches from the dusty edges of Egypt to the lush valleys beyond the Indus, a realm stitched together by ambition and imagination, where stone and law and art were woven into a single civilization. This was the Persian Empire at its most confident, a place where roads were mapped as if by the hand of the sky, where images and symbols spoke of power and piety, and where the idea of order itself became an art. The air carries a sense of motion, of caravans and couriers threading through deserts and mountains, and you can feel the hum of governance that turns chaos into coherent life. To begin is to step onto one of those roads and let the sun set your pace. The royal road is not a single object but a living line, a promise made solid in stone and maintenance. It started as a route for messengers and merchants and became the nervous system of a sprawling state, with stations and couriers that could relay a message across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Picture relays of riders changing mounts, palatial post stations offering shelter and fresh horses, and the confidence of a ruler who could communicate across languages and landscapes. That infrastructure reshaped how power was imagined. Distance no longer made authority distant. As you travel mentally along that road, notice how each turning mirrors political will. The surface was not uniform, cobbles and packed earth, bridges spanning sudden ravines, and causeways over marsh made it possible to move armies and ideas alike. Guardhouses and forts punctuated the way, and each was both practical and symbolic, signifying the empire's reach into places once defined by local law or clan. These fortifications were not merely military, they marked a transition from the unpredictable to the administrated life of a subject under imperial law. The network of roads was a manifestation of a philosophy that good governance required communication, presence, and reciprocity. Couriers moved decrees, tax receipts, and proclamations, and the presence of a road meant the presence of a system of accountability. For those who lived by those roads, the empire became more than a distant name. It touched daily commerce, justice, and resource distribution. Roads were arteries, but in the Persian imagination they were also moral instruments, ways to extend the ethical frame of the court into the provinces. Alongside official routes, trade paths braided outward like a canvas of human exchange, taking silk, spices, metals, and ideas into cities that hummed with diverse tongues. Caravanserai, those roadside inns, offered rest and hospitality not only to traders but to the exchange of stories, recipes, and technologies. You can almost hear the languages overlap at those thresholds: Old Persian, Elamite, Aramaic, Greek, building a polyphony that sustained cultural innovation. In turn, the flow of goods underwrote artistic patronage in the capitals, and wealth allowed artisans to refine crafts into high art. The court itself became a magnet for artists and artisans who labored to embody imperial ideology in stone, metal, and pigment. Palaces rose on terraces that solved the problem of landscape and expressed cosmology, while reliefs carved into staircases and columns narrated the order of kingship. Visual motifs achieved a shared vocabulary, winged figures signaling divine protection, processions asserting the king's benevolence, and geometric patterns offering visual echoes of cosmic harmony. Art was not mere ornament, it was governance rendered beautiful, an instruction in how to see the world under Persian rule. Take Persepolis, for instance, a capital not designed for defense but for representation, a stage where architectural choices declared hierarchy and harmony. Columns soared like forests of living stone, their fluted shafts and ornate capitals lifting the eye toward a ceremonial sky. Reliefs lined the halls with images of subject peoples bringing tribute, and the narrative was clear: diversity folded into a single ordered center where the king mediated between earth and heaven. The architecture choreographed movement, guiding visitors through an experience of imperial cosmology that both humbled and reassured. Yet art in the Persian Golden Age was not only monumental. Everyday objects, metalwork, textiles, and pottery reflected refined tastes and complex technical knowledge. Craftspeople developed new alloys and techniques, and textiles shimmered with dyes and patterns that carried social and symbolic meaning. The technical brilliance of these objects made them portable embodiments of prestige, used as diplomatic gifts or as markers of rank within the court. Their luxury testified to an economy that could support experimentation and leisure, allowing beauty to become a civic practice. The idea of divine order, or a universal law that justified rulership, was central to Persian political theology. Kingship was presented as a responsibility granted by cosmic authority, an alignment of cosmic and social spheres that required careful maintenance. The king was both servant and sovereign, bound by ritual obligations that framed his power as moral stewardship rather than mere domination. This sacred dimension gave imperial action a moral logic. Roads connected not just places but moral obligations, art taught proper reverence, and ceremonies renewed the connection between heaven and palace. Religious pluralism marked the Persian realm. The empire's administrators frequently allowed local cults to continue while situating imperial cultic practice as superior yet inclusive. Zoroastrian concepts may have influenced the Persian idea of truth and order, but the court's ritual landscape incorporated many traditions. Temples and sacred precincts were respected, and the imperial policy of toleration often fostered a sense of imperial benevolence. This tolerance was itself a form of governance. By recognizing local gods and customs, the empire created loyalty without erasing identity, knitting disparate peoples under a single imperial canopy. The ritual calendar of the court punctuated the year with ceremonies that reaffirmed the king's place in the order of things. Processions and festivals dramatized political theology, invoking divine sanction through pageantry. These events were orchestrated spectacles, combining music, recitation, and visual art into moments of collective memory. Participation in these rituals, whether as elite courtiers, provincial emissaries, or modest participants, produced a shared sense of belonging that smoothed the edges of difference. Artworks in public spaces served as mnemonic devices, reminding people of their obligations and the source of their security. Columned halls bore stone reliefs that turned history into scripture, showing subjects paying tribute and thus reinforcing the social calculus of reciprocity, loyalty traded for peace and protection. This visual pedagogy made the empire legible to those who could not read official proclamations. Images bridged gaps of literacy and language. In such scenes, the king's order appeared inevitable and beneficial, a natural harmony produced by wise design. The design of cities under Persian rule reflected an ideal of balance: administrative centers, markets, religious precincts, and residential quarters laid out in ways that facilitated governance and ritual life. Urban planning often took into account caravan routes and the need for repositories and treasuries, connecting economic life with state oversight. Public spaces were designed to host ceremonies, to allow the display of tribute, and to visually project the state's power. Even the smallest civic interventions were intended to produce an experience of order rather than random accumulation. A network of satrapies, provincial governors with delegated authority, made the bureaucracy possible, and they relied on those roads and roadsides to project power. Satraps balanced imperial demands with local customs, serving as translators of policy and practice. Their palaces often adopted imperial stylistics, marrying local aesthetics with the standardized iconography that proclaimed the king's primacy. This blend produced a complex cultural hybridity in which local elites could assert their identity while still participating in imperial ritual life. Communication technologies, though pre-modern, were sophisticated in their own register. Courier stations known as armaria enabled the king to dispatch orders with remarkable speed, and the reliability of these stations depended on a culture of maintenance. Roads were regularly inspected, bridges repaired, and waterways kept navigable where possible. The state's commitment to upkeep underscored the idea that infrastructure was as much a moral obligation as a logistical necessity. Maintaining the arteries of the empire was akin to tending a garden, constant, meticulous, and public-spirited. As you imagine the couriers racing along the road, consider how their movement shaped time itself. News no longer drifted slowly. It became a rhythm, a pattern of expectation that helped central authorities coordinate distant events. Military dispatches, tax assessments, and ceremonial invitations all moved faster, enabling the court to synchronize festivals and responses to crises across regions. The tempo of governance accelerated, and with it, the sense that the empire could reach into lives that might otherwise have remained unconcerned with faraway power. The Persian Golden Age also witnessed remarkable artistic cross-pollination, as motifs and techniques traveled along the same routes as commodities. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan found its way into court jewelry, while Greek sculptural practices informed relief styles in the western provinces. Artisans learned from foreign styles while reinterpreting them within Persian frameworks, producing hybrid works that both celebrated difference and asserted a coherent imperial aesthetic. This cultural plumbing allowed the empire to absorb and reconfigure influences rather than suppress them. Engineering projects extended beyond simple roads to include canals, bridges, and aqueducts that transformed local ecologies into productive landscapes. The construction of qanats, underground channels that transported water from aquifers to fields and towns, demonstrates a technological sophistication in harnessing arid terrains. These waterworks were a lifeline, enabling agriculture in semi-arid regions and supporting urban settlements far from rivers. They represented a form of stewardship, shaping the natural world to sustain the body politic. The very materials used in architecture, stone, timber, precious metals, were carefully chosen for symbolic as well as practical reasons. Stone communicated permanence and gravity, timber allowed subtler artistry, and metals signaled wealth and cosmopolitan connections. Craftsmanship turned raw resources into political language. A gilded frieze or an inlaid threshold spoke as loudly as an edict. The king's palace, in this sense, functioned as a manual for living well. It taught through material example the virtues of order and taste. Music and poetry supplied an oral counterpart to the visual arts, giving voice to themes of justice, piety, and royal benevolence. Court poets composed odes that celebrated imperial achievements and commemorated the king's responsibilities, while musicians provided a soundtrack for ceremonies that reinforced hierarchy. Songs traveled with caravans and were adapted in different tongues, becoming portable repositories of memory. In the evenings, when amphorae were emptied and voices rose, the arts knitted together private affection and public ideology. Language, too, became a tool of administration and identity. Old Persian inscriptions announced royal achievements in a formal tongue, while Aramaic served as a lingua franca for day-to-day governance. This linguistic pairing allowed the state to speak in both ceremonial and practical terms, bridging ritual grandeur and bureaucratic efficiency. Official inscriptions carved on rock and stone were meant to endure, projecting messages beyond the lifespan of any single ruler. Language thus anchored the empire in time, making policy into monument. Economically, the Persian world thrived through a mix of agricultural productivity, taxation systems, tribute, and long-distance trade. The imperial economy depended on the security provided by roads and the predictability of law that allowed merchants to plan routes and investments. Standardized weights and measures were implemented, smoothed transactions across cultural divides, and standardized coinage in certain periods simplified exchange. The resulting economic density supported the patronage networks that funded art and public works. One cannot overstate the role of ceremonial gift exchange in maintaining imperial bonds. Gifts moved from the edges of empire to its center and back again, materializing loyalties and creating obligations that could be called upon in moments of need. Ambassadors and satraps presented objects of exquisite workmanship, and these gifts were catalogued in the royal economy of favor. Objects thus became political texts, readable by those who knew their codes, encoding alliances and gratitude into material terms. The daily liturgy of governance was ritualized in bureaucratic practice. Account books, personnel rosters, tax registers kept the empire legible to itself. The state invested in the mundane work of record-keeping because it knew that empire is nothing without knowledge. Those records empowered administrators to allocate resources, to raise armies, and to adjudicate disputes across distances. The durability of this documentation meant that decisions could be built upon previous knowledge rather than reinvented in each village or province. Artisans and architects often worked under the patronage of the royal court, and their labor shaped the public face of the empire. The relationship between patron and craftsman was one of mutual dependency. Patrons supplied resources and a protective market, while craftsmen translated abstract ideology into tangible form. Workshops became hubs of innovation, and apprentices learned not only skills but the symbolic grammar that made their work legible to the court. These workshops left legacies, styles, techniques, and motifs that outlived individual sponsors. The idea of a divinely sanctioned order required ritual specialists who sustained the metaphysical legitimacy of the system. Priests, magi, and court ritualists performed ceremonies that bound the king to divine favor, interpreting omens and maintaining sacred fires. Their expertise mattered because kingship expected not only administrative competence but cosmic alignment. The priesthood's authority was a social resource that buttressed the state's moral claims and helped channel popular piety into supportive practices for the monarchy. Scholarship and learning flourished in the shadow of this imperial order, as scribes and intellectuals preserved knowledge and adapted foreign ideas. Centers of learning attracted scribes who were trained to copy, translate, and innovate, creating a textual culture that supported both administration and intellectual life. Libraries and archives preserved diplomatic correspondences and records of law, enabling continuity in governance. Literacy, therefore, became not merely a private virtue but a public good facilitating empire-wide coherence. Perception of time was also recalibrated under imperial rule. Annual tax cycles, seasonal festivals, and ceremonial calendars synchronized disparate regions into a shared rhythm. This temporal coordination reinforced the sense that the empire was a single organism with repeating cycles that everyone recognized. Marking time through ritual and fiscal rhythms made sudden disruptions visible and thus manageable, and it communicated stability to subjects and neighbors alike. Time, organized by empire, became a tool of psychological and practical governance. The aesthetics of Persian art often relied on symmetry and rhythm, visual languages that echoed political stability. Repeating motifs and balanced compositions suggested not chaos but order, giving viewers a sense of predictability and reassurance. Even the depiction of exotic animals and foreign attendants was arranged with care, creating a taxonomy of difference that folded into imperial centrality. This visual order did more than please the eye. It structured how people perceived social hierarchies and the natural world under Persian rule. Ritual objects bore inscriptions and iconography that served as catechisms of imperial ideology, teaching correct attitudes toward king and gods through repeated exposure. A throne carved with reliefs of cosmos and kingship was a silent sermon, and audiences learned to read material cues as moral directives. The repetition of these images in multiple media, stone, metal, textiles, spread the message widely and memorably. Art became an education in polity, fostering identification with the empire's foundational myths and values. The Persian commitment to building and maintaining infrastructure affected the lives of ordinary people in tangible ways. Markets grew near road junctions, temples assumed new prominence as civic centers, and craftsmen found more consistent demand for luxury goods. For farmers, new irrigation techniques meant better yields and more predictable lives, though tax burdens could be heavy. In towns, the presence of imperial officials created clerical jobs and markets for luxury imports, altering social hierarchies and livelihoods. The empire, therefore, transformed landscapes and life rhythms in ways that were experienced daily. Diplomacy in the Persian world was an art form, practiced as carefully as any relief carving. Envoys were trained to offer gifts that were symbolic and precise, to speak in measured tones, and to use rituals as tools of persuasion. Embassies traveled along the great roads, and the exchange of gifts and favors created a web of obligations that extended beyond wars and alliances. The careful choreography of diplomatic interaction avoided direct coercion in many cases, using instead a system of reciprocity that appeared both generous and inexorable. Military organization was integrated with the empire's logistical excellence, and the ability to move troops along secure routes gave the king strategic advantages. Garrisons protected key points on the road network, and military engineers helped construct bridges and fortifications that supported rapid maneuver. Armies were not only instruments of conquest but also of policing, ensuring safe passage for commerce and the transmission of law. Their mobility and discipline reflected a broader ethic. The state could accurately project power where necessary while preserving the peace that made roads viable. The visual vocabulary of the empire included many borrowed elements, but it also innovated, creating new symbols that expressed a distinctly Persian imagination. The image of the king as shepherd, for example, borrowed pastoral metaphors but reworked them into a political theology of care and control. Monumental art combined foreign techniques with local narratives to produce imagery that was new yet familiar to diverse audiences. This inventiveness allowed the empire to present itself as universal, absorbing difference into a convincing unity. Women in the Persian world held complex positions, sometimes visible in courtly life and in mythic narratives, and their representation in art could range from the symbolic to the intimate. Royal women could wield influence in patronage and diplomacy, and courtly visibility signaled both prestige and responsibility. Artistic depictions of women often emphasized symbolic roles, caretakers, patrons, or embodiments of fertility, while quotidian life revealed a wider array of domestic, economic, and ritual activities. The imperial order thus included spaces where women shaped cultural life and political practice. The ecology of empire, how humans shaped water, soil, and plant life, was an underrated expression of governance. Through irrigation projects and agricultural policy, the state influenced diets, settlement patterns, and seasonal labor. Command over water was especially crucial, as it determined where towns could flourish and which lands could be taxed. The environmental planning embedded in imperial administration reflected a belief that social order depended on stewarding nature responsibly. Economic inequality, however, was a tension within this ordered world. Wealth concentrated in palatial complexes and among merchant elites, and taxation could be burdensome on peasantries. The imperial narrative of benevolent rule sometimes glossed over these frictions, but they nonetheless shaped rebellions, migrations, and social negotiations. Art and ritual often served to obscure or ameliorate these tensions, providing narratives of reciprocity that smoothed over uneven distributions of power and wealth. Archaeological remains reveal how pervasive imperial symbols were, not only in capitals but in provincial centers that echoed the court's aesthetic. Excavations show palatial plans adapted at smaller scales, relief motifs replicated in provincial workshops, and coinage bearing imperial images circulating far beyond the center. These artifacts testify to a cultural diffusion that was both deliberate and organic, a spread of taste and technique through the same networks that carried grain and silver. The material record thus confirms the depth of imperial reach into everyday life. Local identities persisted under imperial structures, and the empire's ability to accommodate difference was a strategic strength. By allowing certain degrees of autonomy and respecting local religious practice, the court avoided the costs of cultural conquest. Provinces maintained their traditional elites, who often became the empire's intermediaries, translating imperial demands into local terms. This negotiated arrangement produced an empire that was cohesive enough to govern but flexible enough to survive diversity. The moral philosophy underlying royal donations and constructions often linked generosity with legitimacy. The king's largesse, gifts to temples, grants to cities, and patronage of public works translated into civic gratitude and religious sanction. Philanthropy on a civic scale functioned as a kind of soft power, creating networks of loyalty predicated on perceived beneficence. When rulers were generous in this ritualized way, they reinforced their claim to rule not by fear alone but through cultivated goodwill. Craftsmanship in the Persian Golden Age reveals deep technical knowledge. Metalworkers hammered gold and silver into filigree, lapidaries inlaid precious stones with precision, and weavers produced textiles of astonishing complexity. These crafts required specialized training, guild-like systems of apprenticeship, and raw materials that routed through imperial trade networks. Technical manuals may not survive, but the objects themselves testify to accumulated know-how passed across generations. Craft production was therefore an engine of continuity and identity. Legal frameworks under the empire were not monolithic but blended imperial decrees with local law. Satraps and local courts mediated disputes using a mix of royal regulations and customary practices, producing a pragmatic jurisprudence. This hybridity allowed for adaptability while preserving an overarching sense of justice administered from the center. The law, like roads and art, became a medium through which the Persian idea of order was enacted and experienced in daily affairs. Stories and myths about kings, some real, some legendary, helped sustain the moral architecture of rule. These narratives circulated in courtly circles and among common folk, creating shared references that linked present rulers to mythic archetypes. Tales of heroic conquest, wise judgment, and divine favor were retold in many forms, from stone relief to oral performance. Through storytelling, the abstract principles of governance found concrete exemplars that shaped behavior and expectation. The imperial court curated a public image that balanced majesty with accessibility. Ceremonial audiences and processions were highly choreographed to permit controlled interaction between ruler and subjects, distributing the aura of kingship without erasing social boundaries. Such staged visibility allowed the court to model ideal relations, deference exchanged for protection, and to remind subjects of the reciprocal nature of political life. This choreography of power was one of the most sophisticated technologies of rule. At its best, the Golden Age cultivated a sense of shared destiny among disparate peoples, a network in which roads, rituals, and works of art worked together to create a common civic imagination. People recognized themselves in the empire's symbols and thus participated in a political project that promised both stability and cosmopolitanism. That sense, fragile and contingent, made the empire attractive as an organizing principle for life across vast distances. It was neither inevitable nor universal, but where it took root, it reshaped how people conceived of belonging. Yet the empire's reliance on vast infrastructures made it vulnerable. When roads were neglected, communication failed. When tribute ceased, the centers could decline. The maintenance of roads, irrigation, and bureaucratic institutions demanded constant attention and resources, and lapses could produce cascading breakdowns. Still, for long stretches, the Persian system proved remarkably resilient, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving its ideological core. The very fragility of such systems made their maintenance a perpetual moral and logistical obligation for rulers. Beyond the pragmatic, there was an aesthetic sensibility to Persian governance that elevated practical measures into rituals of statecraft. The decision to build a bridge in polished stone rather than crude timber was both sensible and symbolic, a daily reminder that the world could be improved by human design. Craftsmen and priests, engineers and couriers, all contributed to an ethos that valued order as an aesthetic ideal. In this way, the empire turned the mundane into the meaningful. Trade fairs and market days became microcosms of the imperial world, where distant wares were sold next to locally spun cloth, and currency changed hands in organized chaos. These events were social as much as economic, places where news spread and alliances formed. The roads funneled not only commerce but social energies, and markets became nodes where the empire's abstract claims met lived reality. The vitality of these spaces sustained the cultural dynamism associated with Persian imperial life. Education and administrative centers ensured the continuity of governance. Scribes trained in record-keeping and foreign languages formed a professional class that made the empire legible to itself. Their skills allowed for reliable tax collection, diplomatic correspondence, and legal adjudication, smoothing the friction points that might otherwise fracture authority. Apprenticeships and schooling circulated knowledge across generations, producing a cultural memory that the state could draw upon in times of crisis. Knowledge, then, was an infrastructure of its own kind. Imperial imagery often celebrated light and clarity, metaphors that associated the king with illumination, intellectual, moral, and cosmic. Inscriptions praised rulers for bringing order out of chaos, for shedding light on dark places through law and governance. These metaphors were not accidental, they framed political authority as a civilizing light, transforming danger into security and instability into law. Such symbolic language resonated across media, penetrating the visual, architectural, and textual cultures of empire. Regional differences produced local adaptations of imperial styles, and this plurality allowed the empire to appear both unified and responsive. A provincial palace might display the same motifs as Persepolis but with different materials or proportions, signaling respect for central norms while maintaining local identity. This approach minimized cultural resistance and allowed diverse communities to feel recognized within the imperial framework. The result was a dynamic tapestry where unity did not mean uniformity. The preservation of imperial culture and objects and records allowed later generations to reconstruct the ethos of the Golden Age. Reliefs and inscriptions became primary sources for understanding how Persians conceived of power, and archaeologists' careful excavation revealed administrative systems and urban plans. The material persistence of those artifacts attests to the durability of the Persian project and its success in embedding ideas in brick, stone, and metal. Memory, therefore, became a structural feature of empire, inscribed in durable materials for posterity. When the roads fell quiet, or when a palace burned, it was not only economic or military loss but a rupture in the symbolic order. The destruction or neglect of infrastructure signaled the end of certain moral claims, and without visible maintenance, the ideology of benevolent rule eroded. New powers rose to fill those vacuums, often reusing the very symbols they displaced, proving that iconography and infrastructure were tools transferable across regimes. The life cycle of empires shows both the power and the precariousness of built authority. Looking back, we see the Persian Golden Age not as a static pinnacle but as a dynamic constellation of practices, road building, artistic patronage, and ritual governance, that together cultivated a distinctive civilizational grammar. Each element reinforced the others. Roads carried art and priests, art modeled order, and priests sacralized the road's utility. Understanding these interactions helps explain why the Persian system endured as long as it did and why it left such a rich archaeological and textual legacy. In the imagination, the roads remain compelling metaphors for the traffic of goods and ideas, for the interdependence of diverse peoples, and for the ways authority can be both infrastructural and aesthetic. The empire taught a lesson that remains relevant, that power is as much about maintenance and care as it is about conquest. Building an empire, in this sense, meant cultivating ways of life that made rule appear natural and desirable. Art remains the empire's most eloquent voice, speaking across millennia in its balance and detail. The reliefs and vessels, the carved capitals and inlaid jewelry, continue to whisper about cosmology and kingship, about the careful crafting of public life. When you look at a frieze where foreign princes bring tribute, you are looking at a visual contract between ruler and ruled, a negotiated performance of loyalty and protection. Those images teach us that aesthetics and politics were never separate in Persian statecraft. Divine order, in the Persian view, was not an abstract theology but a lived practice linking ritual, law, and infrastructure. The king mediated the sacred and the secular, and his actions, building, gifting, legislating, were performative acts that sustained cosmic balance. This performance shaped how citizens imagined their relationship to authority and to each other, creating a moral geography that mapped onto the physical one. The Persian state crafted the world in its image, and in doing so it taught citizens how to live within it. The things that made the Persian Golden Age lasting were kinetic, movement of people, circulation of objects, and the ritual renewal of power. Everything depended on motion, and that motion required both physical pathways and cultural scripts that guided behavior. Roads were therefore much more than stone and earth, they were moral conveyors, carrying the narratives that allowed an empire to identify itself. In this sense, the Persian achievement was as much about choreography as about construction. Finally, consider the intimate scale: a craftsman in a provincial workshop learning a new motif, a courier pausing at a night station to exchange news, a priest tending a fire before a festival. These small acts, repeated thousands of times, constituted the lived world of empire. The grand achievements, the palaces, the roads, the laws, were the culmination of everyday practices woven together into something larger than any single actor. The Golden Age therefore rests in countless moments of care and skill that, when joined, produced a civilization of remarkable scope. The story begins not with a single moment but with a slow, gathering silence that settles over an empire already ancient in its own lifetime. The Achaemenid realm had spanned deserts and seas, mountains and river plains, stitched together by roads and rules and the peculiar gravity of a title, the King of Kings. That phrase alone carried weight, a claim to the allegiance of satraps and tribes, to tribute broadened by camel and galley, to languages folded into the bureaucracy. By the time the figure called Darius sat on the throne, the empire had become both monument and burden, a map of the known world in which every border invited calculation and every court entertained intrigue. The world into which Alexander strode was not simply a political chessboard, it was a living mosaic of peoples accustomed to rule and to being ruled. Cities hummed with markets, debates in public squares, the clatter of artisans, and the hush of palaces where eunuchs measured out influence in measured bowls of wine. Persian kings had long invested in the architecture of authority, palaces raised and remade, reliefs carved to show the king receiving tribute from the farthest provinces. Authority in those places was as much display as decree, and that display would become a target as Alexander's shadow stretched eastward. Alexander of Macedon arrived with an army that was both modern and intimate, a machine of disciplined spearmen and cavalry hardened by years of campaigning against Greek police. He carried a hunger for glory that made every horizon an invitation. But conquest is not accomplished by hunger alone. It is accomplished by timing, by exploiting fractures, by understanding the human fissures that lie beneath empire. He found those fissures in the Achaemenid world, satraps who cherished their autonomy, mercenary troops whose loyalties could be bought, and a royal court where rumor traveled faster than loyalty. The first clashes were not titanic wrestlings of two equal neighbors so much as the opening of a door left unlatched. At the river called Granicus, Macedonian phalanx met Persian cavalry and Greek mercenaries, and steel decided the order of things. The river could not stem the fever of Alexander's men, who fought for plunder and the promise of land. Victory at Granicus was not merely military, it was a psychological blow that told cities and governors that the old world center was not impregnable. From riverbank to coastal city, the campaign became a lesson in speed and will. Alexander moved like an idea that could not be caught, flitting from one capital to another, accepting surrenders when they were offered and punishing resistance with an efficiency designed to dissuade others. At Issus he confronted Darius III on a battlefield that proved the Persian commander was neither the invincible deity the propaganda of empire had once suggested nor a mere incompetent. Darius fled when victory could have been within his grasp, and the image of the monarch abandoning his army made an impression that would echo through court poetry and enemy rumor alike. Each defeat peeled away not only territory but reputation. The satraps, upon whose cooperation the empire had been built, were practical men. They watched the courses of events and balanced their oaths against survival. As Alexander advanced, some satraps opened their gates, others plotted in taverns, and some chose to stand and die. That variation was the Achaemenid system's undoing. Woven through it were knots of local loyalty that could be untied when the central thread tugged in a new direction. The conquest of coastal cities changed the texture of the fight. Tyre, a city insulated by sea, posed a unique challenge. Alexander could not simply march in and take it. He built a causeway, he employed siegecraft and hurlers and human endurance until a city that had been a symbol of maritime freedom surrendered. When the walls crumbled, the slaughter and enslavement that followed made other cities weigh the cost of resistance. The psychology of fear, wielded as a tool, brought swift compliance as the campaign moved inland. When Alexander crossed into Mesopotamia and set his sights on Babylon and Persepolis, the heart of Persian ceremonial life quivered. Babylon, with its canals and temples, opened its gates to him with a surprising grace. He entered and was greeted by a city whose wealth and cultivation were the envy of the world. Persepolis presented a different sort of conquest. It was not just strategic or economic, it was emblematic. The palace complex, the great hall where kings had received the motley of their empire, became not only a prize but a stage for symbolic transformation. The burning of Persepolis would be interpreted by many as the deliberate obliteration of Persian memory. Ancient sources suggest a mixture of motives: a drunken revel turned destructive, vengeance for Persian invasions of Greece generations before, a calculated act to demonstrate irreversible change. Whatever the true intent, flames licking at timber and cedar and the collapse of colonnades sent an unambiguous message. To destroy a palace is to set fire to a set of claims, the divine sanction of kingship, the civilizing narrative of the court, the aesthetic certainty that empire would last by architecture as much as arms. Yet the destruction of monuments does not erase the people who built them. Across the empire, artisans continued to hammer reliefs, scribes continued to copy accounts, farmers continued to plow. Alexander's conquest often relied on this continuity. He adopted Persian dress, employed Persian court officials, took satraps into his administration. There was always a practical strain to his curiosity, a willingness to incorporate customs that would help him rule more easily. In that accommodation, the seeds of a hybrid world were planted. As the months turned into years and the campaign pushed east into the plateau of Iran and toward the Indus, the logistical strain on Alexander's army became profound. He was not only fighting battles, he was, in a sense, fighting the map. Distance wore away at supplies, discipline, and patience. The further they marched, the more local differences mattered. Climate, language, and the inertia of regional identities all conspired to slow the machinery of conquest. Yet victories continued. At Gaugamela, Alexander again outmaneuvered Darius, and with that the phrase King of Kings became, as a title and as a power, less anchored in any one palace and more dependent on the loyalty of soldiers under arms. In the wake of battle, the human cost was immeasurable. There were bodies on the field, of course, but there were also lives unmoored, administrators displaced, local elites recalibrating relationships, merchants rerouting trade, children orphaned by sudden violence. Conquest rewired economies. Cities that had been nodes in a Persian network found themselves reoriented toward new centers of power shaded by Macedonian commanders turned governors. The old flows of tribute and supply persisted but now ran along different hands and through different legal assumptions. Alexander's deeper challenge was not merely military, it was ceremonial. To rule the lands across which he marched, he needed to become something more than a foreign conqueror. He staged royal pomp, accepted Dianic honors and local rites, and sought marriages that mixed the Macedonian bloodline with Persian nobility. This blending was both strategic and sincere. He wanted to create a dynasty that could claim legitimacy on both sides of the cultural divide, but in doing so he pushed his Macedonians to accept new hierarchies and customs that some viewed as betrayals of the old Macedonian republican spirit. The Macedonian troops, veterans of long campaigns, reacted to these innovations in ways that pulled at the seams of Alexander's project. They had followed a charismatic leader, but they were not blind to the costs of unfamiliar ceremony and the imposition of foreign court practices. There were moments of mutiny and discontent, particularly when customs felt to them like a dismissal of their sacrifices. The tension between an emperor's ambition and the temper of his army produced fractures that would widen after his death. In the city of Babylon, where Alexander eventually made his administrative center, the air was thick with possibility and tension. He dreamed of creating a world empire stretching from Greece to India, a polity held together by a fusion of institutions. He convened counselors and scholars, minted new coinage bearing hybrid images, and planned monumental works. Yet he also spent long nights drinking and probing the edges of his own authority, haunted by the knowledge that empires are held together not only by law but by stories. The death of Alexander at a young age in that very city became the hinge upon which an entire order turned. He left no clear heir with the strength to carry on his synthetic empire. He left instead a collection of generals, each brilliant, each ambitious, who became known to history as the Diadochi. Their fighting was both personal and structural. They claimed provinces, assassinated rivals, and married into local dynasties. Their wars transformed the map again, carving the once unified empire into smaller Hellenistic kingdoms. Those successor states bore different relationships to Persian heritage. The Seleucids, who controlled much of the eastern territories, attempted to maintain a veneer of Achaemenid continuity even as they consolidated Greek institutions and brought in settlers from the west. They founded cities with Hellenic institutions, planted Greek speakers across the heartland, and encouraged a culture of rhetoric and philosophy. But they also relied on Persian administrative know-how, and in many corners the two cultures began to meet and mingle in daily life. Hellenistic rule was neither a total erasure nor a gentle preservation. In some places it produced dynamic creativity, new art forms, syncretic religions, and fusion cuisines. Statues wearing local dress appeared alongside Greek guises. The image of kings shifted to accommodate models of the past and present, and coins began to show rulers with features that appealed to multiple constituencies. Yet Hellenism often depended upon Greek settlers and an elite that was not always acceptable to indigenous populations, which meant resistance could flare when policies favored newcomers over old families. Inside the former Achaemenid lands, satrapal identities shifted. Local governors used the chaotic years after Alexander to increase their own power, fortify regional loyalties, and sometimes declare independence. In the west, kingdoms like Pontus and Cappadocia carved domains, while in the east, Armenian and Bactrian elites asserted themselves. The administrative machinery built by the Persians did not vanish overnight, rather it was repurposed. Records continued to be kept, taxes were still levied, and the rhythms of agrarian life steadied the region even as imperial banners changed. But empires are tested most ruthlessly along their frontiers. Nomadic tribes and rising states pressed on the borders, and the central authority of the Hellenistic realms was stretched thin. Parthia, beginning as a relatively obscure satrapy, exploited both the disarray of Seleucid control and the weakness of distant centers to grow into power. A house of steppe riders, they blended Iranian and nomadic traditions, mastering cavalry warfare that was perfectly adapted to the open spaces of the steppe. Their emergence as a rival constructed a new axis of contest between East and West. The Parthian ascendancy was not merely martial. It represented a shift in the grammar of kingship back toward local Iranian models. Parthian rulers adopted titles and customs that resonated with the peoples of the plateau. They were less concerned with the trappings of Hellenistic urbanism and more with forging a coalition of tribal aristocrats and rural magnates. In that choice lay their strength, a model of rule that fit the land and its people better than a Hellenistic court that depended on Greek-speaking elites scattered across distant cities. The clash between the Parthians and their western neighbors, including Rome, would become one of the defining dramas of the ancient world. Unlike the sweeping conquests of Alexander, this was a long, attritional contest, skirmishes at borders, elaborate diplomacy, and shifting alliances. Parthian horse archers could shatter Roman formations with lightning speed, while Roman discipline and engineering could besiege cities and construct roads that stitched empires more tightly together. The result was a centuries-long dialogue of force and accommodation. It is tempting to sum such transitions as triumphs of one culture over another, but that obscures how porous boundaries really were. Trade caravans continued, carrying silk and glass, spices and metals, while ideas accompanied goods. Religious practices crossed linguistic lines, cults borrowed rituals, scholars wrote in multiple tongues. The resulting cultural landscape was layered, and memory of the old Achaemenid world persisted not only in tales of palaces and kings, but in laws and place names, and in the daily practices of governance that outlived the dynasty itself. Within this shifting world, local elites were essential actors. They mediated between rulers and subjects, often retaining a degree of autonomy because governors needed their knowledge and networks. Landholders and temple priests wielded influence that kings found difficult to displace. In many provinces, the full shape of power was not a pyramid but a web, and that web, and the people's loyalty would outlast several dynasties. In other words, the fall of the kings was rarely absolute. It was complex, partial, and threaded with continuity. Religion and ritual provided another axis of continuity. Zoroastrian rites, temple ceremonies, and local cult practices continued in rural and urban settings. Over time, these beliefs could be adapted, syncretized, and reframed within new political contexts. The spiritual life of ordinary people proved resilient, a subterranean river that sustained communities as dynasties shifted like sails on a sea. Even when ruler cults changed, and the faces on coins were altered, the rhythms of worship and seasonal ceremony kept a sense of order intact. Memory itself became a contested landscape. New rulers curated the past, choosing which monuments to restore and which to neglect. Sometimes the past was invoked to legitimize the present. Builders plastered over old reliefs and carved new inscriptions beside the old, claiming continuity with whatever ancestors suited their political needs. Other times memory was a political tool, invoked to denounce previous regimes as corrupt or foreign. Thus the ruins of the Achaemenid world could be read as both relics and instruments, depending on who stood before them and what they wanted to say. Commerce was a quieter engine of continuity and change. Trade linked the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and the routes that had fed the Persian imperial economy continued to move goods long after the royal bureaucracy had been rearranged. Cities that adapted to changing flows prospered, those that did not often declined. Money changed hands across cultures, and the design of coins told a story of shifting legitimacy, Greek gods rubbing shoulders with Eastern symbols, portraits of rulers reflecting changing fashions and claims. The architecture of authority evolved too. Where grand palaces symbolized centralized power in the Achaemenid age, Hellenistic rulers favored market towns and gymnasia that reflected Greek civic life. Later Parthian strongholds revived fortress-like designs better suited to a world of horseback raids and local power brokers. Each architectural choice revealed priorities, whether a ruler wanted to be perceived as a civilizer, a military protector, or a restorer of local tradition. These choices influenced how common people experienced power in their daily lives. In the background of all these political changes, the land itself played its part. Rivers flooded, harvests failed occasionally, and climates shifted on long cycles. When famine or drought hit, governments were judged by their ability to ensure grain and to maintain canals and roads. A successful regime in these regions was one that could keep the wheels of agriculture and trade turning. It did not matter that much whether its king wore Macedonian armor or Achaemenid robes. Infrastructure, the silent backbone of empire, could be neglected to calamitous ends. Language served as both barrier and bridge. Greek became the lingua franca of administration in many Hellenistic realms, and its cadences carried literature and philosophy into new corners of the old Persian world. Yet local languages persisted in countless inscriptions, in the speech of markets, and in the prayers of temple-goers. Scribal traditions adapted, sometimes producing bilingual documents that revealed the pragmatic multilingualism of ancient administration. This linguistic plurality built a cultural resilience that allowed communities to survive even as political masters changed. The human faces of this story deserve attention beyond names of kings and dates of battles. Consider the artisan who carved a relief at Persepolis, the farmer in a distant province who paid his taxes grudgingly, the Greek soldier who married a local woman and raised children who spoke two tongues. Their lives are the quiet archive of empire, a patchwork of loyalties, compromises, and everyday courage. They reveal how continuity is not only a matter of institutions but of human choices made for survival, comfort, or aspiration. Yet for all the continuities, the idea of kingship itself transformed. The older Achaemenid claim to universal rule, expressed in processions, gift-bearing delegations, and royal inscriptions, had once been an assertion of cosmic order. By Alexander's time and after, kingship in the region became more personalized and fragmented. Rulers had to perform legitimacy in a world where multiple claims overlapped and contested each other. Legitimacy required more performance and less accepted assumption. As the centuries moved onward, the Persian heartlands became a crucible of new dynasties. Parthia coexisted and contended with Rome for centuries, and then a new Persian power rose in the 3rd century, the Sassanids. The Sasanians mounted a deliberate revival of Iranian traditions, styling themselves as heirs to a pre-Hellenistic past and pursuing policies that emphasized centralized authority and Zoroastrian orthodoxy. The rise of the Sassanids shows that the fall of one dynasty does not equate to erasure. Cultures can reassert themselves, reshaping the past to forge new futures. Memory and reinvention are twin forces in history. The Sasanian claim to Achaemenid lineage was part performance and part political necessity. It gave new rulers a narrative to justify taxation, conscription, and expansion. It also offered the people symbols that felt familiar, court rituals, royal iconography, and a restored reverence for certain ancient sanctuaries. The past thus became a resource for the present, mined selectively to authorize policies and to rally subjects under a shared banner. The long shadow of Alexander is an even more complicated shape. He had shattered an empire, but he also knitted parts of that world together in new ways. Greek ideas mingled with Iranian customs, Hellenistic art influenced local aesthetic, and the legacies of his brief reign shaped administrative and military practices for generations. His empire did not survive as a monolith, but its aftereffects reverberated in coinage, in cities, and in the very idea that a single man could reshape the map of the world through ambition and audacity. At the level of thought and culture, the exchanges were profound. Philosophers traveled east, mathematicians and astronomers found centers where Greek and Persian knowledge could be compared and combined. The cross-pollination enriched both traditions, giving rise to scientific advances and new schools of thought. This intellectual traffic was not simply the movement of elites, it filtered into schools and workshops, influencing the ways people measured the sky, built instruments, and understood the cosmos. The arts recorded this transformation in visual language. Reliefs and sculptures combined stylistic elements from both worlds, producing a hybrid aesthetic that spoke across cultures. In cities downriver from the imperial centers, artisans produced objects that would make sense whether found in a Persian shrine or a Hellenistic agora. Those objects, pottery, textiles, jewelry, are small testimonies to a world that, despite political turmoil, remained deeply interconnected. Trade routes are worth returning to because they functioned like arteries in the body of empires. Caravans and caravanseries connected distant markets, and demand for luxury goods created networks that were resilient to political change. Silk from the east, spices from far provinces, and metals from mountain mines continued to move, linking consumer tastes across continents. Economic interdependence made outright isolation difficult and fostered a degree of pragmatic cooperation even between hostile powers. Law and administration, inherited in part from the Persian system, were retooled by successive regimes. The mechanics of tax collection, dispute resolution, and property rights showed a continuity even as rulers changed. Local courts continued to rely on established norms, and where new rulers tried to append these norms, they often faced backlash. Administration thus became a conservative force, slow to change and loyal to the practices that had once sustained an empire. The political geography of the region also meant that external pressures, Mede, Scythian, Arab, constantly tested rulers. Those around the margins could not be ignored. The interactions with nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples shaped military tactics and diplomatic strategies. Cavalry innovation, the use of horse archers, and flexible command structures were all responses to the environment. Military adaptation was a constant conversation between the realities of land and the ambitions of kings. Social structure was slower to morph. Family networks, patronage systems, and guilds continued to distribute power and resources. Women, though often invisible in political histories, exerted influence through marriage ties, property, and the management of households. Courtesies and obligations structured daily life in ways that could outlast a particular monarch's whims. In other words, the fabric of society provided a resilience against the cycles of rise and fall that marked elite politics. Religious plurality also shaped political responses. The coexistence of different faiths in urban centers required rulers to be tactful. A heavy-handed religious policy could provoke resistance, while tolerance often produced more stable governance. Thus many rulers, whether Hellenistic king or Parthian monarch, chose policies that were pragmatically pluralist, even when they claimed special favor from one tradition or another. Cultural memory was preserved in monuments and in literature. Poets, chroniclers, and oral storytellers transmitted versions of the past that served multiple ends, mourning lost glories, defending the present, or warning future rulers. Epic narratives folded conquest into morality tales that explained how fortunes change. Those stories became part of the social air, shaping how people interpreted their lives and their kings. The fall of the kings of kings, then, is not a neat epical moment but a long process of unweaving and reweaving. Empires fragment, local powers rise, and new empires claim the mantle of old. Yet underneath these apparent ruptures lies a durable substrate, the daily practices of agriculture, law, worship, and trade. These continue not because rulers desire them, but because ordinary people demand them in order to live, to marry, to bury their dead, and to negotiate scarcity. Even in ruins, the Achaemenid past retained a persuasive presence. Later kings invoked its imagery to justify their own rule. Artists referenced it when they wished to signal power or continuity. The material culture, brick, relief, inscription, acted as a kind of long-term memory device. A palimpsest where new texts were written over old, but the trace of the original remained visible if one looked carefully. There is a human melancholy to watching empires pass. The grandeur of palaces and the precision of administrative records speak to collective achievements. Yet we must also attend to the violence, the displacement, and the coercion that built them. The burning of palaces, the looting of treasuries, and the forced migrations are as much a part of the record as the carved stele. To honor history is to witness both human greatness and human cost. The legacy of those centuries continues to inform our world. Ideas about kingship, law, and administration that crystallized in the Persian and Hellenistic worlds fed into later empires. Byzantine and Islamic rulers would draw on, transform, and sometimes reject the political vocabulary invented in those years. These societies did not vanish, they were repurposed in new political architectures that emerged out of necessity, conquest, and imagination. When modern scholars and travelers first reopened Persepolis and other ancient sites, they found not only stone and pottery but stories layered in sediment. Each fragment of pottery, each column drum, is a witness to human life extending across millennia. Recovering these objects invites questions about continuity and change, about how memory is maintained and how myth is made. It is a form of listening to voices that persisted despite the roar of kings and the sweep of conquest. In the end, the fall of the kings of kings is less an absolute finale than a transition into a different set of shadows. The lineages and institutions that seemed decisive in one century merely altered their shape in the next. Empires are ephemeral in part because they depend on human institutions that are themselves mutable. Yet the human practices that sustain life, farming, worship, trade, family, provide a stubborn persistence that outlives banners and titles. When you trace these threads across centuries, you see patterns, cycles of centralization and decentralization, a recurring need for legitimacy, the cleverness of local strategies to survive, and the constant mediation between force and consent. The Persian imperial project was both fragile and durable. It collapsed under certain pressures, but elements of it persisted through adaptation, reinvention, and incorporation into subsequent polities. Perhaps the most important lesson from this long tale is that history does not proceed in tidy lines. It is messy, braided, and full of compromise. The shadow of a king can be long, reaching across centuries to influence art, law, and memory. Yet that shadow alone cannot sustain a realm. It needs institutions and people willing to live by its claims. When those institutions fray, and when people decide their lives are no longer worth the costs of empire, decline follows. The story also teaches us about the interplay between symbolism and administration. Monuments and titles matter because they shape belief, but a belief unsupported by the institutions that deliver grain and adjudicate disputes cannot long sustain a populace. Alexander and his successors discovered this truth in different ways. They sought to command loyalty through spectacle, but they also needed to maintain the more mundane systems that allow civilizations to function. The tension between show and substance is an ancient political dilemma. Finally, the shadows of history are populated by real people whose small acts knit together the fabric of continuity. A scribe recording a deed, an elder settling a land dispute, a merchant shipping cloth to a distant port, these are the acts that ground empires in the material world. They are the quiet heroes of continuity, the ones who keep channels open even when the great houses of kings burn and collapse. Their work is the reason why empires leave traces rather than disappear entirely. When you drive past a ruin or stand before a broken column, remember that what you see is the residue of 1,000 decisions: to build, to conquer, to administer, to pray, and to rebuild. Each stone bears witness to both ambition and the small economies of daily life. The fall of the kings was not an apocalypse but a reconfiguration, a turn in history that produced new forms of power and new varieties of memory. To listen to this story is to recognize how history is always both close and distant. The emperors belong to a past that shapes our institutions, our languages, and our myths, and yet the people who lived under their shadows moved in ways that feel remarkably familiar. They navigated risk, made bargains, loved, and mourned. Those rhythms are our inheritance, and in them we can find the answer to how civilizations die and are reborn as something else. And so, as dust gathers on the plain where once multitudes marched under the standard of a king of kings, take a moment to imagine the past as a living presence. Listen for the footsteps of soldiers and the chatter of markets, for the hymns sung in temple courtyards and the counselors whispering in palace corridors. The fall of a dynasty is rarely the fall of a culture. It is, instead, the turning of a page, a complex, noisy, human page, where endings become beginnings under different names. History never really ends, it just changes names. Subscribe and write in the comments if you feel closer to the power that vanished or to the new beginnings that rose from its ashes.